Hello, and welcome to Tales by Imon. Settle in as we begin a journey into the heart of a quiet town, a town on the brink of an identity crisis it doesn't even see coming. This is the story of the town that forgot its name. Chapter 1. The town was a place you'd think you knew, even if you'd never been there. It was nestled in a valley carved by a lazy, winding river, surrounded by hills that turned a brilliant gold in the autumn. It had a main street, complete with a diner that served coffee in thick ceramic mugs, a hardware store where the owner, Mr. Henderson, could find any bolt or screw you needed just by the description, and a town square with a proud white-painted gazebo at its center. It was the kind of town that felt safe, permanent. A place where history wasn't just in books, it was in the worn brick of the sidewalks and the ancient oaks that lined Elm Street. My name is Ethan Hayes, and I'm the town librarian. For me, history and memory are not just concepts, they are my profession. The library is my sanctuary, a fortress of facts built from paper and ink. It's a quiet place, filled with the gentle rustle of turning pages and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. I've always believed that everything worth knowing, everything that makes us who we are, can be found on its shelves. I was about to learn how wrong I was. The beginning of the end, or perhaps the beginning of the great forgetting, started on a Tuesday. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, the kind that blends into all the others. The sun was streaming through the tall, arched windows of the library's history section, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden sprites. I was in the archives, a place that smelled of decaying paper and leather-bound promises, working on a preservation project for the town's founding documents. I was handling the original town charter from 1883. The paper was brittle, the color of weak tea, and the calligraphy was a work of art. I'd seen it 100 times. But on this Tuesday, as I leaned in closer under the magnifier lamp, my brow furrowed. The top of the document, where the town's name was elegantly scripted in bold, confident strokes, looked off. It was blurry, smudged, as if a single drop of water had landed there a century ago and patiently worked to dissolve the ink. I could make out the swooping capital letter at the start, and the tail of the final letter, but the name itself was an illegible smudge. Strange, I mumbled to myself, adjusting the lamp. I could have sworn that was clear last month. I chalked it up to the age of the document and my own tired eyes. I made a mental note to check the digitized copy later. There was a rational explanation for everything, after all. That's what I'd always told myself. I finished my work and, as I did every Tuesday, locked up the library a little after 5. My routine was as unchanging as the river's current. A walk down Main Street, a nod to Sheriff Thompson as he did his evening patrol, and a stop at the Daily Grind, the bakery run by the town's unofficial grandmother, Mrs. Gable. The bell above the bakery door chimed merrily as I entered. The air was thick with the warm, comforting scent of cinnamon and freshly baked bread. Mrs. Gable was behind the counter, her white hair tied up in a neat bun, her face a roadmap of kindly wrinkles. "The usual, Ethan?" she asked, her voice warm as her oven's. "You know it, Martha," I smiled. "1 cinnamon roll and a black coffee to go." As she packed the pastry into a small white bag, I leaned against the counter, making small talk. "Big day coming up," I said casually. "The Founders' Day parade is just around the corner." I was just looking at the old charter. Martha Gable paused, her hands hovering over the coffee machine. She looked at me, a flicker of confusion in her bright blue eyes. "Founders' Day? Oh, of course. For the town." She laughed, a light, airy sound, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. You know, for a second there, I couldn't quite, well, you know how it is. A senior moment. I smiled back, but a small cold seed of unease was planted in my gut. Martha Gable knew more about this town's history than I did. She was a walking, talking archive of local lore. For her to hesitate, even for a second, was like a sailor forgetting the name of the sea. "Happens to the best of us," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. I took my coffee and pastry, paid her, and wished her a good evening. Walking home, I couldn't shake the feeling. The smudge on the charter. Martha's momentary blankness. They were two small, unconnected things. A coincidence. My mind, the ever-logical librarian, insisted on it. But my intuition, a quieter, more primal part of me, felt a current of wrongness in the air. That evening, I sat in my favorite armchair, the cinnamon roll long gone, the coffee cup empty. I opened my laptop and navigated to the library's digital archives. I pulled up the high-resolution scan of the town charter, the one I had overseen myself just last year. I zoomed in on the top of the document, on the space where the name should be. It was exactly as I had seen it on the physical copy. A blurry, indecipherable smudge. My heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't possible. Digital copies don't smudge. They are static, perfect captures of a moment in time. I frantically searched through my backup files, then the server's cloud storage. Every version was the same. The name was gone. It was as if it had been erased from the past, and the erasure had rippled forward through time to affect every copy. I stood up and paced around my small living room. This was insane. I was overthinking it. It had to be a technical glitch. A corrupted file that had somehow overwritten the backups. It was improbable, but it was the only rational explanation. To calm myself, I decided to do something simple. Something definite. I would say the town's name out loud. Just to prove to myself that I was being ridiculous. I stood in the center of my quiet room, took a deep breath, and opened my mouth to speak. And nothing happened. The name, the simple familiar sequence of sounds I had spoken and heard thousands of times, was gone. It was right there, on the very tip of my tongue, a ghost of a word. I could almost feel its shape in my mouth, the way my lips should form, the vibration it should make in my throat. But when I tried to grasp it, to give it voice, it dissolved into mist. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my carefully constructed logic. I tried again, focusing all my will. It was like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. I knew the name. Of course, I knew it. I lived here. I grew up here. I ran the library I ran for the door and stepped out onto my porch. The night air was cool. The streetlights cast a gentle, orange glow on the empty street. Across the way, the Miller family's lights were on. I could hear the faint sound of their television. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. But it wasn't. I looked up at the moon, a perfect silver disk in the inky sky, and I felt a profound sense of dislocation, of being unmoored. I was a man standing in the middle of his hometown, a place he knew better than the back of his own hand, and for the life of him, he could not remember its name. And the most terrifying thought of all, the one that truly made the hair on my arm stand up, was the sudden, chilling question: was I the only one? The silence of my own mind was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. The name of my home, a word that should have been as natural as breathing, was locked away in a box I couldn't find the key for. Standing on my porch, the familiar sight of my neighborhood offered no comfort. Instead, it felt alien, a movie set where I'd forgotten my lines. Was I losing my mind? Was this some kind of bizarre, localized stroke? The librarian in me, the man who organized facts for a living, scrambled for a logical foothold. But the primordial, instinctual part of me knew this wasn't a medical issue. This was something else. Something external. Sleep was an impossibility. My mind was a racetrack of questions. Was it just me? Was it just the charter? Was Martha Gable's hesitation really just its senior moment? I had to know. I couldn't spend the night trapped in the echo chamber of my own panicked thoughts. I needed data. I needed another test subject. I grabbed my car keys from the hook by the door, my movements stiff and robotic. My old sedan, usually a comforting and familiar machine, felt like a stranger's car. I got in and drove, not with a destination in mind, but just to move, to feel the world scrolling past my windows. I drove past the high school, its empty football field bathed in the ghostly glow of security lights. I passed the town hall, its clock tower dark. These were the landmarks of my life, the geography of my soul, and yet they all felt like pieces of a puzzle with the most important, central piece missing. They were just the school and the town hall in a town called nothing. Then, a beacon of light cut through my spiraling thoughts, the neon sign of the Night Owl Diner. It was the only place open at this hour, a refuge for truckers passing through, night shift workers, and the town's insomniacs. It was a place for honest, unfiltered conversation. It was perfect. I parked and walked in, the jingle of the bells sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. The diner was nearly empty. A lone trucker hunched over a plate of eggs at the far end of the counter. Behind the counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth, was Chloe. She was a college student, working nights to pay tuition. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a perpetually unimpressed expression that I always found amusing. If anyone would give me a straight, unvarnished answer, it was her. "Burning the midnight oil, Mr. Hayes?" she asked without looking up from her task. "Or did you run out of books to read?" "Something like that, Chloe," I said, sliding onto a stool. "Just coffee. Black." She nodded, grabbing a clean mug and filling it from the pot. She slid it in front of me. The rich, bitter aroma was grounding. For a moment, things felt normal. "Couldn't sleep," I said, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. I needed a plausible story, a reason to ask the question without sounding insane. My mind raced. A tourist. A lost driver. No, that was too clumsy. I needed something more personal, more believable. I decided to use the truth, or a version of it. You know, a funny thing happened today, I began, my voice carefully casual. I was working on the old town archives, and you wouldn't believe the state of some of the documents. The ink has faded so much on the original town charter, the name is practically gone. It got me thinking, and it's going to sound crazy, but I'm drawing a complete blank. It's like when you say a word so many times it starts to sound weird. I forced a small laugh. Just humor me. What do we call this place? Chloe stopped wiping the counter. She finally looked at me, a slight frown creasing her brow. She opened her mouth to answer, a flicker of amusement in her eyes at my seemingly ridiculous question. And then, she paused. Her mouth closed. The amusement vanished, replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. What do you mean? She asked, her voice suddenly flat. It's here. It's home. I know, I pressed gently, my heart hammering against my ribs. But what's the name on the welcome sign? She leaned her hip against the counter, crossing her arms. Her eyes unfocused as she stared at the far wall, searching her own mind. I could see the struggle on her face. It was the exact same feeling I'd had, the feeling of reaching for a familiar object in the dark and finding only empty air. This is stupid, she finally said, her voice tight with frustration. She shook her head as if to clear it. It's... God, why can't I? She looked at me, a hint of accusation in her eyes, as if I had somehow planted this confusion in her head. It's just been a long shift. My brain is fried. She turned away abruptly and started refilling the salt shakers with unnecessary vigor, her movements sharp and agitated. She didn't have the answer. It wasn't just me. The confirmation didn't bring relief. It brought a tidal wave of pure, cold dread. This wasn't a personal failing, it was a collective one. A contagion of forgetting was spreading through my town, and no one had even noticed. I left a few dollars on the counter and walked out of the diner, leaving Chloe to her salt shakers and her own budding unease. There was one final test I had to perform. One final piece of evidence I needed to see with my own eyes. I got back in my car and drove towards the edge of town, where Route 7 became Main Street. I drove towards the large, hand-carved wooden sign that had greeted visitors for over 50 years. Welcome to... It said in big, friendly letters. As I got closer, I slowed the car. My headlights washed over the familiar landmark. The sign was there, nestled between two tall pine trees. The large, sweeping letters spelling "Welcome to" were clear and solid. But the space beneath it, where the town's name was spelled out in its own set of individually carved letters, was impossible. It wasn't blank. It wasn't smudged. The letters were there. I could see their shapes, their wooden texture, the way the dark green paint had chipped slightly at the edges. But I couldn't read them. When I tried to focus on the word, my vision seemed to slide right off it. The letters would blur and shimmer at the edge of my perception, refusing to resolve into a coherent word. It was a cognitive blind spot, a piece of reality my brain was now forbidden from processing. I pulled the car over and got out, standing in the middle of the empty road, bathed in the glow of my own headlights. I stared at the sign, trying to force it into focus, my eyes watering from the strain. It was no use. The name was there, and it was not. It existed and it was unknowable. The forgetting was not just in our minds. It was in the world itself. The ink on the page, the letters on the sign, they were all conspiring with the silence in our heads. We hadn't just forgotten our name. Our name had forgotten us. I looked back down the road, at the distant warm lights of the houses and street lamps. For the first time in my life, I didn't see a community. I saw a collection of lost people, living in a place that no longer had a title, floating through existence without an anchor. We were all residents of nowhere. The drive back from the edge of town was a journey through a foreign country. I kept the radio off, embracing the silence, because I was afraid of what I might hear. Would a local broadcast be able to say the name? Or would there just be a burst of static where it should be? I didn't have the courage to find out. My home, the grid of streets I could navigate with my eyes closed, now felt like a ghost map. The foundation of my reality had cracked, and I was terrified of how deep the fissure went. I didn't sleep. I sat in my armchair, watching the black of the night slowly fade into the gray of dawn, my mind a maelstrom. The problem wasn't just a forgetting. It was a physical, tangible phenomenon. An unknowing. It was as if the universe had issued a cosmic redaction, blacking out a single piece of information so thoroughly that it affected ink, paint, and memory alike. What was the next logical step when logic itself had ceased to apply? There was no one to call. No authority to report this to. Hello, police. I'd like to report a missing word. I would be the town lunatic. No, I had to be methodical. I had to observe. If this fading was happening to everyone, how was the town still functioning? The machinery of daily life, mail, commerce, government, all relied on a shared sense of place, on a name. How were people compensating for its absence? The next morning, I set out with a new purpose. I wasn't just Ethan Hayes, librarian. I was an investigator in a town of unknowing subjects. My first stop was the post office. It was a squat brick building, a bastion of federal certainty and routine. If any place should be immune to this ambiguity, this would be it. I walked in behind Mrs. Patterson, a retired schoolteacher. She was mailing a package to her son in California. I pretended to browse the greeting cards, watching her out of the corner of my eye. She filled out the shipping label with practiced ease. Name, street, city, state, zip. Then she got to the return address section. She wrote her name, her street address. And then she stopped. Her pen hovered over the label for a long, pregnant moment. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she searched for a word that wasn't there. Finally, with a slight, frustrated sigh, she scribbled something. From my angle, I couldn't see exactly what. She paid the postage, and as she walked away, I stepped up to the counter. The postmaster, George Finney, a man who had been sorting mail in this town for 40 years, gave me a curt nod. Morning, Ethan. Stamps. Yes, please. A book of forever stamps, I replied. As he was getting them, I glanced over at Mrs. Patterson's package, which was now sitting in a bin behind the counter. On the return address, where our town's name should have been, she had simply written the zip code. Just the 5 digits. A number. A clever, unconscious workaround. A piece of data that could stand in for the missing word. Everything running smoothly today, George? I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. George grunted, his brow furrowed in concentration as he counted my change. As smooth as it ever does. Though, I'll tell you, Ethan, something feels off-kilter. Can't put my finger on it. The sorting machine's been acting up. Not breaking down, you understand. Just hesitating. Like it's thinking too hard. He shook his head. Probably just needs a tune-up. But I knew it wasn't the machine. The machine was likely trying to read addresses that people were subconsciously omitting or replacing. The system was developing hiccups because a fundamental piece of its logic had been removed. My next stop was the town square. I sat on a bench near the gazebo and watched the town go by. It was a beautiful day. People were smiling, greeting each other. On the surface, everything was normal. But I was listening now, truly listening. And I started to notice the verbal acrobatics, the linguistic detours people were taking. Sheriff Thompson was talking to Mayor Collins. We'll need to set up the barricades from the corner of Oak Street all the way to the bridge for the parade, the mayor said. He didn't say the downtown parade or the Founders Day parade. He just said the parade. 2 women walking by were discussing their plans. Are you going to the farmer's market this weekend? One asked. Of course, the other replied. It's the best one in the whole valley. She didn't say the best one in our town. She used a geographical descriptor instead. It was everywhere. People were using pronouns like here and this place. They were defining the town by what was around it, the valley, the river, the county, but never by what it was. We were an island of anonymity, and our residents were subconsciously learning to speak a new dialect that allowed them to talk around the gaping hole in our collective identity. The most chilling observation came when I walked past the elementary school. Kids were out for recess, their high-pitched laughter filling the air. A group of girls were jumping rope, chanting a familiar rhyme, one I remembered from my own childhood on this very playground. Hey, my name is Amy, my husband's name is Alex. We come from, and we sell apples. When they got to the part about where they came from, they didn't say a word. They just added an extra, rhythmic skip of the rope. They filled the void with an action, a beat of silence that they all understood and accepted without question. The forgetting had infected the children. It was being woven into their games, becoming a part of their culture. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just a shared amnesia. This was an active, ongoing process of erasure. We weren't just forgetting, we were adapting to the forgetting. And in adapting, we were cementing the loss, making it a permanent feature of our existence. The name was a pillar of our identity, and now that it was gone, the entire structure was beginning to warp. Defeated, I retreated to the one place that had always made sense, the library. My fortress of facts. I needed to see if the erasure had breached these walls. With a sense of dread, I walked to the local history section. The spines of the books were a familiar sight. I ran my finger along them until I found what I was looking for. Or what should have been there. A thick, blue-bound book. The title on the spine had always read, A Comprehensive History of Town Name. My breath caught in my throat. The spine now read, simply, A Comprehensive History. My hands shaking, I pulled the book from the shelf. I flipped it open, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I turned pages filled with familiar stories, the founding of the first mill, the Great Fire of 1922, the profiles of former mayors. I finally found what I was looking for, a full-page map of the county from the early 1900s. My town was on it. I could see the river, the railroad tracks, the intersection of the main roads that formed its heart. A small, black dot marked its precise location. But the space next to the dot, the space where the elegant, cursive letters of its name should have been printed, was empty. It wasn't smudged like the charter. It wasn't unreadable like the sign. It was perfectly, pristinely blank. It was clean, empty paper, as if the ink had never touched it. As if the name had never existed at all. It wasn't just forgotten. It was being unwritten. I stood there in the silent, dusty aisle of the local history section, holding a book that had become an artifact of an impossible crime. The blank space on the map wasn't an omission, it was a wound. The name hadn't just been forgotten, it had been surgically removed from the historical record, the incision so clean that no scar remained. My sanctuary, my fortress of facts, had been breached. The erasure was not just a fog in our minds, it was a tireless editor, working its way through every page of our past. My first panicked instinct was to check every other book. I pulled them from the shelves one by one, my hands frantic. Pioneering Families of the Valley, The Railroad in Our Town's Rise, A Photographic Journey Through. The titles were now vague, truncated. Inside, pages of text had been subtly altered. Sentences were rephrased to avoid the unnameable. Where the name was once essential, the paragraphs now contorted themselves into awkward shapes to talk around it. The book wasn't just missing a word, it was rewriting itself to accommodate the loss. This discovery changed the nature of my quest. My goal could no longer be to simply remember. Remembering was futile when the evidence of the past was actively vanishing. My new mission was to find proof. I had to find an external source, a record created so far away, so disconnected from this place, that it might be immune to the creeping blight of unknowing. My mind, trained in the art of research, began to build a strategy. The local records were compromised. I needed to think bigger. State and federal archives. I started with the library's collection of state maps and atlases, books printed in cities hundreds of miles away. I pulled out a heavy atlas from the 1970s, published in Chicago. I found our state, our county, the familiar spiderweb of roads and rivers. I traced Route 7 with my finger until I found the dot that represented my home. And there, next to it, was the same pristine, mocking blankness. The erasure wasn't contained within the town limits. It radiated outward, a ripple of non-existence that affected any document that dared to name this place. The sheer scale of it was dizzying. It defied all known laws of physics and information. There was one last bastion of objective data I could turn to, the internet. The digital world was vast, its data stored on servers scattered across the globe. Surely, some forgotten corner of the web, some cached web page or obscure database, would hold the key. I sat down at my desk, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I thought back to the post office, to Mrs. Patterson's unconscious workaround. The zip code. It was a string of numbers, not a word. Perhaps it was immune. I opened a search engine and typed the 5 digits into the bar, my heart pounding with a strange mixture of hope and dread. The results populated instantly. The top result was Google Maps, showing a perfectly rendered satellite view of my town. The streets were there, the buildings, the river. The borders of the zip code were highlighted with a red line, forming the familiar shape of our jurisdiction. But the label, the name pinned to the center of the map, simply read the 5 digits of the zip code. Not a name, just a number. The United States Postal Service website was the same. The zip code was valid, registered to a post office at a specific street address, but the field for city name was empty. The digital world hadn't preserved the name. It had simply adapted to its absence with brutal efficiency. To the great, logical mind of the internet, if a town had no name, its zip code would suffice. We had been neatly and clinically recategorized. We were no longer a community with a history, we were a delivery zone. I leaned back in my chair, the hum of the computer a low, monotonous drone. I was hitting a wall. Every path I took led back to the same blank space. The feeling of isolation was crushing. I was a man who knew a terrible, world-altering secret in a town of people who were subconsciously accommodating their own slow-motion vanishing act. I couldn't do this alone. I needed an ally. I needed someone else who had felt that same flicker of wrongness, that moment of cognitive dissonance when a simple word refused to come. My mind went back to the diner, to the frustrated, confused look in Chloe's eyes. She had felt it. She had dismissed it as fatigue, but I knew she was too sharp to let it go that easily. She was a skeptic, grounded in the real world, and that's exactly what I needed. If I could convince her, then maybe I wasn't going crazy. I found her that evening, wiping down tables at the end of her shift. The diner was empty again. She looked tired, and the unimpressed expression was firmly back in place. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low. She sighed, not breaking her rhythm. "If you're going to ask me the name of the town again, Mr. Hayes, I'm going to have to charge you for the coffee and a therapy session." "It's not just a weird brain fart, Chloe. It's real," I said, sliding into a booth. "And it's happening to everyone." She stopped wiping and finally looked at me, her expression a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Look, I've had a long day. I've got a paper on macroeconomics to write. I don't have time for conspiracy theories." "This isn't a theory." I pulled the heavy history book from my tote bag and placed it on the table, opening it to the county map. "Look." She reluctantly leaned over, her eyes scanning the page. I saw the moment her skepticism wavered. She traced the blank space with her finger. "Okay, a misprint. It's an old book." "It wasn't a misprint yesterday," I said softly. I then took out my phone, pulled up the map search for our zip code, and showed it to her. "The internet doesn't have misprints like this. It's empty. The name is gone. Everywhere." She stared at the phone, then back at the book. I could see her sharp mind trying to find a logical explanation, a simple answer that would allow her to dismiss me and go back to her life. "This is crazy," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "Try it," I urged. "Right now. Try to say the name. Not as a joke, but really try to say it." Chloe stood up straight, a defiant look on her face. She took a breath, ready to prove me wrong, to put an end to this ridiculous conversation. She opened her mouth. And just like me, just like her own previous attempt, she froze. The word wasn't there. The frustration on her face was quickly replaced by a dawning, naked fear. The color drained from her cheeks. She slowly sank into the booth opposite me, her eyes wide. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I answered, my voice filled with a grim sense of relief. I wasn't alone anymore. "But I think it's getting worse. The name isn't just forgotten. It's being erased. And we have to figure out why before there's nothing left of this place to save." She stared at me from across the vinyl tabletop, the fluorescent lights of the empty diner humming above us. For the first time, I saw the cynical armor fall away, replaced by the terrified resolve of someone who had just looked over the edge of a cliff and seen that the ground was gone. "Okay, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice small but firm. "What do we do now?" The late-night hum of the diner's coolers was the only sound for a long moment. Chloe and I sat in the booth, the history book lying open between us like a patient on an operating table. The question she had asked, "What do we do now?" hung in the air, heavy and immense. For the first time, the I of my lonely investigation had become a we. The shift was monumental. It didn't make the fear go away, but it gave it shape. It turned my quiet, internal panic into a shared, tangible problem that we could begin to dissect. "We start at the beginning," I said, my voice finding a new firmness. "I was a librarian. My life was dedicated to the principle that knowledge is power, that the answer to any question can be found if you just know where to look. Whatever this is," I gestured to the blank space on the map, "it's an attack on our identity, on the town's name. So, we need to understand what the name meant, why it was chosen, why it's so important that something would go to such lengths to erase it." Chloe leaned forward, her earlier exhaustion replaced by a focused, nervous energy. "You think the name itself is special? Like magical?" I hesitated. The rational part of my brain recoiled from the word. "I think it's significant," I hedged. "Towns get their names for reasons. From a founder, a geographical feature, a historical event. The name is the first chapter of a town's story. If we can find that first chapter, maybe we can figure out who, or what, is trying to erase the rest of the book." We used the empty diner as our first strategy room. We brainstormed on the back of a paper placemat, a strange tableau under the buzzing fluorescent lights. Chloe, with her sharp, practical mind, cut through the fog of the supernatural. Okay, so we can't look at official records. Books, signs, maps, websites, they're all compromised. It's like they're connected to a central server that's being wiped. We need to find an offline source. Something personal. Something that wasn't meant to be an official record. Diaries, I said, the idea clicking into place. Letters. Personal journals. They aren't formal history. They're impressions, emotions, secrets. They might have slipped through the cracks. My mind immediately went to one specific collection. The town's founder, I said, my voice quickening with excitement. Silas Blackwood. He was a strange man, by all accounts. Heart pioneer, heart philosopher. When his estate was settled, his great-granddaughter donated all his personal effects to the library. Journals, letters, ledgers. It's all in the archives. In a big, leather trunk. A plan began to form, a desperate, exhilarating long shot. We would go to the library. We would go through Silas Blackwood's most private thoughts, page by page, and hope that he had written down a clue that the great erasure had missed. Getting into the library after hours was no challenge. I had my own key. But unlocking the door and stepping into the vast, silent darkness felt different tonight. It wasn't my sanctuary anymore. It was a crime scene. Chloe followed me in, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished linoleum. The building was a tomb of compromised information, and we were searching for the one ghost who might still be willing to speak. In the archives, the air was thick with the scent of time itself. I led Chloe to the far corner where the Blackwood trunk sat, a relic from another century. It was bound with iron straps and covered in dust. As I lifted the heavy lid, it groaned in protest. Inside lay the life of Silas Blackwood, preserved in paper. There were brittle yellowed letters tied in ribbon, thick, leather-bound ledgers filled with records of trade and land purchases, and at the very bottom, a stack of smaller, more intimately worn journals. His personal diaries. You take the letters, I'll start on the journals, I whispered, though there was no one to hear us. 4 hours, we worked under the dim glow of a single desk lamp, the only sounds the rustle of delicate paper and our own soft breathing. Much of what we read was mundane. Blackwood wrote of the harsh winters, of negotiating with fur trappers, of his dreams for a prosperous community built on hard work and mutual respect. He mentioned street names, the construction of the first mill, the births and deaths of the first generation of citizens. But every time he referred to the town itself, the same phenomenon occurred. There was a smudge, a gap, an expertly rephrased sentence. The erasure had reached back through time to edit the hand of the founder himself. Despair began to set in. If the founder's own journals weren't safe, what hope did we have? Ethan, look at this, Chloe whispered, her voice sharp. I moved to her side. She was pointing at a page in the final journal, dated the day the town was officially chartered. The handwriting was different from the rest, agitated, almost feverish. Blackwood wrote not of celebration, but of a solemn duty fulfilled. The charter is signed, the entry read. The agreement is sealed. The land is ours, and prosperity is assured, so long as the compact is honored. The guardian of this valley does not ask for gold or prayer, only for acknowledgement, for its name to be known. In turn, I have given this place its own name, a reflection of the shelter we have been granted. My eyes scanned down the page, my heart racing, and then I saw it. The sentence where he should have declared the name. But just like in the official charter, the ink was a blurred, watery mess, a chaotic smudge where a word used to be. It's gone here too, I breathed, the flicker of hope dying. Wait, Chloe said, her finger tracing a section in the margin next to the smudged passage. What's this? In the margin, scribbled in what looked like a trembling hand, was a short, cryptic verse. It wasn't part of the main entry. It was an afterthought, a secret note from Silas Blackwood to himself, where the silent giant sleeps in stone, and the river whispers a silver tone. Look to the heart that does not beat. To find the name of this retreat. We stared at the riddle, the strange words seeming to hum with an ancient energy. It was a puzzle, a set of directions. It wasn't the name itself, but a key. A key that the erasure, in its relentless, logic-based search for a specific word, had overlooked. It had deleted the answer but had left the question behind. The silent giant sleeping in stone? The river's silver tone? The heart that doesn't beat? It was nonsense, and yet it was the first real clue we had. It was a thread. In a world that was coming undone, Silas Blackwood had left us a single, unbroken thread to follow. We didn't know what it meant, but as we stood together in the dead quiet of the library, we knew our mission had changed once again. We were no longer just researchers. We were treasure hunters, and the map was a 150-year-old riddle. Our town had a secret, and its founder had just told us where to start digging. We stood in the cavernous silence of the library, the single desk lamp casting long, dancing shadows around us. The journal lay open on the table, Silas Blackwood's cryptic riddle the only solid thing in a world that was turning to smoke. It was a lifeline, a map written in a language of metaphor, and it was all we had. "Okay," Chloe said, breaking the silence. She paced back and forth in the narrow aisle, her mind clearly working at a rapid pace. "Let's break it down. Where the silent giant sleeps in stone." "That has to be a landmark," I said, my own mind racing through my internal catalog of local geography. "Something people would know. There's a ridge west of town, the one that blocks the harshest winter winds. The ridgeline, from a certain angle, looks like a man's face lying on his back, staring at the sky. My grandfather used to call it the Stone Sentinel." Chloe snapped her fingers. "We just call it Old Man's Ridge. We used to dare each other to climb it as kids. It's right where the river makes that sharp bend." "The second line," I read aloud, a thrill of connection running through me. "And the river whispers a silver tone." The river does bend right at the base of the ridge. The water runs shallow there, over a bed of smooth, pale granite that shimmers in the sun, or the moonlight. It looks like liquid silver. We were getting somewhere. The first two lines were a location, a specific, recognizable place. It was the last two lines that were the true puzzle. "Look to the heart that does not beat," Chloe recited, her brow furrowed in thought. "What's the heart of a place like that? It's just woods and rocks." "A heart is a center," I mused, thinking aloud. "The core of something. And it doesn't beat. It's not alive. Not an animal. It's an object. Something placed there." I thought of the first settlers, of Silas Blackwood himself. What was the first thing they built when they settled here? Before the mill, before the town hall. A cabin, a fort. Chloe offered. "A meeting place," I said, the pieces clicking together. "There are ruins at the base of the ridge, in that clearing by the river. Just a foundation, really. It's supposed to be the site of Blackwood's original cabin, the first structure ever built here. It was the first heart of the community." Chloe's eyes lit up. "The old fireplace is still there. Just a pile of rocks, but it's in the middle of the foundation. The hearth. Hearth sounds like heart. The heart that does not beat," I finished, a broad smile spreading across my face. We had it. The riddle was a set of coordinates leading to the ruins of Blackwood's first cabin, at the silver bend of the river, under the shadow of the stone giant. We had a destination. There was no thought of waiting for morning. The urgency of our situation was a current pulling us forward. We packed the journal carefully into my bag, along with a pair of heavy flashlights from the library's emergency kit. In the trunk of my car, I had a small toolkit with a crowbar, just in case. The drive out of town was tense. The familiar streets felt different now, charged with a secret meaning. We were two people moving through the quiet night, armed with a 150-year-old poem, on our way to fight an enemy that had no name. We parked where the dirt road ended and continued on foot, the beams of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. The only sounds were the crunch of our footsteps on the gravel path and the distant, constant murmur of the river, the whispering silver tone. Soon, the trees opened up, and we were in the clearing. Above us, the silhouette of the ridge was a massive, dark shape against the starry sky. I could just make out the profile of the giant, a stoic guardian sleeping through the ages. The moonlight hit the surface of the river, and just as the riddle promised, it shimmered with a pale, ethereal light. In the center of the clearing stood the ruins. Time had worn them down to a mere suggestion of a structure, a low outline of foundation stones half buried in the earth. And there, in the middle, was the collapsed fireplace, a jumble of heavy, moss-covered river stones. The heart. "Okay," Chloe said, her voice a hushed whisper. "What are we looking for?" "Something that doesn't belong," I replied, shining my light over the pile. "A marker, a symbol, a loose stone." We searched for nearly half an hour, our hopes beginning to fade. It was just a pile of rocks. Maybe we'd been wrong. Then, Chloe let out a small gasp. "Ethan, here." I hurried over. She was pointing her flashlight at a large flat stone at the base of the old hearth. It was the same type of river stone as the others, but etched onto its surface, so faint it was almost invisible, was a symbol, a simple compass rose, the kind found on old maps. It was a sign. This was the place. Using the crowbar from my toolkit, we worked together, grunting with effort, to pry the heavy stone from its resting place. It finally gave way with a scraping groan, revealing a dark, square cavity beneath it. And nestled inside, resting on a bed of what looked like dried leaves and grass, was a small, dark metal box. It was heavier than it looked, made of cast iron, and sealed with a simple but effective latch. It was cold to the touch. My hands trembled as I worked the latch, the rusty metal creaking in protest before finally snapping open. We both leaned in, our flashlights pointed into the dark interior. I don't know what I was expecting. A piece of paper with the name written on it? A map. But it was something far stranger, and far more beautiful. Inside, cushioned on a faded piece of black velvet, was a single object. It was a small, wooden carving, no bigger than my palm, crafted with exquisite detail from a dark, rich wood. It was a carving of a magnificent stag, its head lowered, drinking peacefully from a flowing stream. Towering over the stag, its branches seeming to offer protection, was a massive, ancient oak tree. We stared at it, utterly bewildered. It was a beautiful piece of art, perfectly preserved. But it wasn't a name. It wasn't an answer. It was another riddle, this one told not in words, but in wood. The erasure had been searching for a word to delete. But Silas Blackwood, in his strange wisdom, had left behind something it couldn't touch. An idea. A picture. A symbol. We had solved his first puzzle, only to be presented with a second, more profound one. What did this silent, beautiful scene mean? And how in the world could a carving of a deer and a tree tell us the name of our town? We knelt in the damp grass of the clearing, the iron box open between us. The world seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of us and the small, carved object in my hand. The moonlight gave the polished wood a soft, living glow. It was a perfect, silent story, a stag, a stream, a tree. A moment of absolute peace, captured in wood. It was beautiful. It was mysterious. And it was, in that moment, profoundly frustrating. So that's it, Chloe whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. After all that, the big secret is a tiny wooden deer? It has to mean something, I insisted, my thumb gently tracing the smooth lines of the carving. Blackwood wouldn't have gone to this much trouble for a simple piece of folk art. The riddle, the hidden box, this is the key. We're just not reading it right. We packed up our discovery, replaced the heavy stone over the empty cavity, and made our way back to the car in a state of quiet confusion. The triumphant energy of solving the riddle had been replaced by the daunting task of interpreting its answer. During the drive back to town, we tossed theories back and forth, our words filling the confines of the car. Maybe it's literal, Chloe suggested, staring out at the dark trees lining the road. Stag Creek, Oak Haven, Hearts Crossing. The name sounded plausible, like any number of small towns across the country, but they felt hollow, generic. They didn't resonate with the strange, specific nature of our problem. I don't think it's a rebus puzzle, I said, shaking my head. Silas Blackwood's journal didn't read like a man who would use simple wordplay. He wrote about philosophy, about creating a society, a shelter from the wider world. The name would have to reflect that. The carving isn't a collection of words, it's a scene. It's a single, powerful idea. Back in the library's archives, the familiar scent of old paper felt like a comfort. We placed the carving on the desk under the bright, unforgiving glare of the lamp. Now we could see the details we'd missed in the moonlight. The wood was dark, heavy oak. The craftsmanship was incredible. Every leaf on the tree, every ripple in the water, every strand of fur on the stag was rendered with loving precision. On the flat, felted bottom, 2 initials were burned into the wood. S.B. Silas Blackwood had carved it himself. Okay, I said, taking on the role of the researcher. Let's break down the symbolism. What does it all mean? I grabbed a notepad and a pen, needing to impose some kind of order on the mystery. The stag, I began. In folklore, stags often represent nature, nobility, strength. They're also sometimes seen as guardians of the forest, a symbol of the wild, untamed world. But this one isn't wild or fierce, Chloe pointed out, her perception as sharp as ever. Look at its posture. It's calm. It's at peace. It's found a safe place to drink. Exactly, I said, scribbling on the pad. It's found sanctuary. Now, the oak tree. That's one of the most powerful symbols there is. It represents strength, endurance, wisdom, longevity. But most of all, it represents protection. Shelter. I looked at her, the pieces beginning to form a coherent picture in my mind. And the stream. Water is life, purity, sustenance. So what is the entire scene telling us? It's a story of a noble creature finding safety, shelter, and life-giving water under the protection of something ancient and strong. I leaned back, looking from the carving to my notes. The whole theme, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, is sanctuary. I thought back to the feverish entry in Blackwood's journal. He had written about his town being a shelter, a retreat. The carving was a perfect, visual representation of his founding philosophy. He hadn't just built a town, he had created a refuge. Chloe and I looked at each other, a shared understanding passing between us. We started saying words aloud, testing their feel, their weight. Refuge, I said. It was close, but not quite right. Shelterwood, she offered. Sanctuary, I tried. We kept going, the words circling the central theme. And then, Chloe said a word that seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with possibility. Haven, she said softly. Like a safe harbor. The word felt different. It felt right. A haven. That's what the stag had found. But the word alone felt incomplete. It didn't account for the most dominant feature of the carving. My eyes were locked on the massive protective oak tree. A haven. I repeated slowly, letting the word settle. A haven in the woods. My gaze met Chloe's. Her eyes were wide. In that moment, we both saw the final piece of the puzzle click into place. It was so simple, so elegant. Havenwood, we said in unison. The moment the word was spoken, something shifted. It wasn't a thunderclap or a flash of light. It was a subtle, internal change, like a tuning fork resonating in my very bones. The carving in my hand seemed to pulse with a faint, pleasant warmth. In my mind's eye, I saw the smudged entry in Blackwood's journal, and for a fleeting, ghostly second, the word was there, clear as day, Havenwood. A wave of giddy relief washed over me. We had done it. We had found it. The name was Havenwood. Our town was Havenwood. I laughed, a sound of pure joy. We did it. It's Havenwood. But my joy was short-lived. I grabbed the notepad to write the name down, to give it permanence, to prove it was real. But as my pen touched the paper, the ink refused to form the letters. I could write an H, but the A would become a meaningless squiggle. I tried again, concentrating with all my might, but the word would not take shape. It was as if the paper itself rejected it. A cold dread began to replace my relief. Chloe saw the look on my face and understood instantly. She stood up and took a deep breath, as if to shout the name to the library's rafters. This town is called. She began, but the name caught in her throat, the final syllable dissolving into a choked gasp. We could say it to each other, softly. We could hold it in our minds. But we couldn't declare it. We couldn't write it. We couldn't restore it. We had found the name, but the erasure still held its power over us, over everything. I looked at the journal, at Blackwood's words about the compact and the need for acknowledgement. Knowing the name wasn't the final step. It was only the first. The Guardian, whatever it was, didn't just want its tribute to be known by two people whispering in a basement. It wanted the entire town's belief. Our impossible task had just become infinitely harder. How do you give a name back to thousands of people who don't even realize they've lost it? The library's archive room, which had been the site of our great discovery, now felt like a prison cell. We were two wardens holding the key to a forgotten word, unable to tell any of the inmates that the door was unlocked. We possessed the single most important piece of information in the world, and it was utterly, maddeningly useless. The name, Havenwood, was a ghost we could see but no one else could hear. This is impossible, Chloe said, slumping into a chair and running her hands through her hair in frustration. What's the point of knowing the name if we can't use it? We can't write it, we can't say it to anyone. We might as well not know it at all. She was right, of course. Direct communication was out. The force that was erasing our town was also actively censoring it. Trying to speak the name aloud to someone else was like trying to shout in a vacuum. The intent was there, but the medium wouldn't carry the sound. Trying to write, it was like trying to paint with water on a stone. If we can't give them the answer, I said, thinking slowly, pacing the length of the room, then we have to make them find it themselves. We can't force the memory on them, but maybe we can help them remember on their own. We have to lead their minds to the answer without ever stating it. Chloe looked at me, her expression skeptical. How do you do that? Leave a trail of breadcrumbs for an entire town? Exactly, I replied, a new strategy beginning to form in the ruins of our last one. We can't use the name, but we can use the symbols of the name. The stag, the oak tree, the stream. The idea of a haven, a sanctuary. Blackwood's carving wasn't just the answer, it's our instruction manual. We have to reintroduce the town to its own lost symbolism. We have to saturate this place with the ingredients of its own name. A perfect opportunity was already on the horizon. An event the town was planning out of sheer, muscle-memoried habit, the annual Founders' Day Festival. It was the one time of year the whole community came together to celebrate its own history, a history they could no longer name. Their enthusiasm for it had been waning for years, the celebrations growing more generic and less attended. It was a symptom of the deeper sickness. But this year, it would be our stage. As the librarian, I'm on the planning committee, I explained, the plan solidifying. The first meeting is tomorrow night. They're going to be looking for a theme. And you're going to give them one, Chloe finished, a spark of understanding in her eyes. Our roles fell into place naturally. I would work from the top down, through the town's official channels. My weapon would be history, suggestion, and civic procedure. Chloe would work from the ground up. Her battlefield would be the diner, the coffee shops, the conversations on the street. Her weapons would be social influence and popular opinion. We would launch a two-pronged, subliminal assault on the town's amnesia. The next evening, I walked into the town hall's stuffy conference room. The Founders' Day committee was all there. Mayor Collins, Martha Gable from the bakery, Mr. Henderson from the hardware store. They all looked bored, going through the motions. Well, the mayor began with a sigh, I suppose we need a theme for the parade floats. How about a salute to local business? Mr. Henderson offered, as he did every year. This was my moment. Mayor, I interjected, trying to keep my voice steady. I've been going through some of the founders' oldest documents in the library archives. Unofficial letters, diary entries. And it's truly fascinating. His vision for this place wasn't just about commerce. It was about creating a refuge. A place of strength and shelter from the harshness of the outside world. I saw a flicker of interest in Martha Gable's eyes. I pressed on. I think for this year's theme, we should honor that original vision. Something like, our founding strength, or a shelter in the valley. I was careful, using the concepts without using the keywords directly. We could celebrate the symbols of that ideal, the endurance of the mighty oak tree, the noble spirit of the wildlife in our hills. The room was quiet for a moment. They weren't just hearing an idea, they were hearing a faint echo of a story they had forgotten they knew. I like that, Martha Gable said softly. It feels right. More meaningful than just celebrating businesses. One by one, they agreed. The official theme for the Founders' Day Festival was now built around the symbols of its own forgotten name. The first seed was planted. The next day, the operation expanded. I put up a new display in the library's main entrance, the natural heritage of our valley. It featured beautiful photographs and historical sketches of the native flora and fauna. The centerpiece was a massive, framed photo of a majestic stag, and next to it, a cross-section of a fallen oak, its ring showing centuries of growth. Meanwhile, Chloe went to work. We heard that the high school art class was tasked with painting the banners for the festival. Chloe casually stopped by to talk to the teacher, mentioning the library's inspiring new display. She talked about how powerful the image of the stag was, how the oak tree represented the town's deep roots. At the diner, she suggested a Founders' Day special to Martha Gable's son, who now managed the place. You know what would be great? A pancake breakfast. You could use a stencil to put a powdered sugar oak tree on top. Call them Sunrise Oaks or something. The ideas were like a virus of suggestion, spreading quietly through the community. The seeds we were planting began to sprout in the most unexpected ways. The high school banners, hung across Main Street a few days later, were magnificent. They didn't just feature generic parade slogans. One depicted a massive oak tree whose branches sheltered a silhouette of the town. Another showed a stylized stag, its antlers seeming to cradle the clock tower. Chloe and I stood on the sidewalk, watching as Mr. Henderson helped hang the last banner directly in front of the town square. It was a direct, almost perfect recreation of the carving, a stag drinking from a stream at the foot of an oak. People walking by stopped to look up at it. I heard a woman murmur to her husband, "That's just beautiful. I don't know why, but it feels so familiar." Her husband nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "It feels like home," he said. They couldn't say the name. They couldn't remember the word. But they were beginning to recognize the picture. They were beginning to remember the feeling. A fragile hope began to bloom in my chest. Our subliminal message was being received. The Founders' Day parade was in 2 days. It would be the final test. We were teaching our town its name again, one symbol at a time, hoping that when the time came, they would be able to speak it aloud. The morning of Founders' Day dawned crisp and bright, the autumn air holding the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. There was a palpable energy in the town, an electricity that had been absent for as long as I could remember. It was more than just excitement for a parade. It was a sense of collective anticipation, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Chloe and I met at the diner for an early coffee. The place was already packed. The sunrise oak pancakes were selling faster than the cooks could make them. Children were showing off their freshly painted faces, some with delicate, branching antlers, others with a single proud oak leaf on their cheek. Our quiet, subliminal campaign had taken on a life of its own, blooming into a vibrant, public spectacle. The symbols of Havenwood were everywhere. "It's working," Chloe said, her voice a low murmur filled with awe as she surveyed the bustling room. "Look at them. They're happy. They feel connected." She was right. The apathy that had settled over the town like a persistent fog was lifting. People were talking to their neighbors, laughing, sharing stories. They were acting like a community again. The shared symbols were giving them a shared identity, a common language to speak, even if they were missing the most important word. We had reminded them of the story, and now they were subconsciously yearning for the title. We spent the next hour walking through the town as the final preparations for the parade were made. It was even more pervasive than we had hoped. Oak leaf garlands were twined around lampposts and storefronts. The high school marching band warmed up on the football field, a newly painted stag's head adorning their bass drum. Every float that was lining up was a testament to our theme. The garden club had constructed a breathtaking float depicting a forest scene, with a real, live oak sapling at its center. Our quiet suggestions had been embraced with an enthusiasm that was almost desperate, as if the town was starving for meaning and we had just provided a feast. When the parade began, the entire town lined Main Street. The cheers were louder, more genuine than they had been in years. The floats rolled by, each one a moving monument to our town's forgotten name. When the Historical Society's float appeared, I felt a lump in my throat. We had a high school drama student dressed as Silas Blackwood, and beside him was a huge, painted banner showing the carving scene, a stag, an oak, a stream. The crowd applauded thunderously for it, their cheers echoing off the brick buildings. They were applauding their own lost history, and they didn't even know it. The parade culminated, as it always did, in the town square. The crowd gathered around the white gazebo, a sea of expectant faces. This was the moment of truth. Mayor Collins, a man whose speeches were usually forgettable compilations of civic platitudes, stepped up to the podium. He looked out at the crowd, at the banners, at the happy upturned faces, and he seemed to draw strength from it all. "Good morning," he began, his voice stronger than usual, amplified by the microphone. "What a wonderful day. What a wonderful turnout. It does my heart good to see so much spirit, so much pride in our town today." He spoke about the theme, about the importance of remembering our roots, the vision of our founder. He used the words we had given him: sanctuary, shelter, refuge. With each word, I could feel a subtle shift in the crowd's energy, a deeper listening, a collective leaning in. "For too long," the mayor continued, his voice swelling with an uncharacteristic passion, "maybe we've taken this special place for granted. This place that has kept us safe, that has nurtured our families. Our home. Our..." He paused. The word was on the tip of his tongue. I could see the struggle on his face. His brow was furrowed, his knuckles white on the podium. He was pushing against the mental barrier, the invisible wall that had held the name captive for so long. The crowd went utterly silent. It was a heavy, profound silence, filled with the weight of 1,000 people subconsciously reaching for the same lost word. For a split second, I was sure he was going to say it. The full name. Havenwood. His mouth opened, he took a breath, and then the word came out, not in a triumphant shout, but with the force of a confession. "Our haven." The word exploded from the speakers, clear and pure. It wasn't the whole name, but it was the heart of it. It was the concept, the promise, the soul of the word. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I saw people turn to look at one another, their eyes wide with a dawning, shocked recognition. The word haven settled over them, not as a new piece of information, but as a memory resurfacing. It felt right. It felt true. On 1,000 tongues, the word was silently tasted and acknowledged. Haven. Chloe grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "He said it," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief and triumph. "He actually said it. It was a victory. A massive, staggering victory." But as the crowd began to buzz, a low murmur of excitement as people tried the new old word for themselves, my eyes were drawn away from the gazebo. I scanned the edges of the crowd, and my blood ran cold. Standing half hidden in the deep shadows of the alleyway between the hardware store and the bakery was a figure. It was impossible to make out a face, but they were tall and thin, dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothing that didn't belong in our time. They were not looking at the parade or the crowd. They were staring directly at the mayor in the gazebo, and the posture was not one of celebration. It was one of cold, silent fury. It was the posture of a warden who had just discovered a prisoner escaping. The figure seemed to feel my gaze and turned its head slowly, its shadowed face fixing on me. I couldn't see eyes, but I could feel them. It was a look of pure, chilling malevolence. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back into the deeper shadows and vanished. The joyous noise of the crowd faded to a dull roar in my ears. Our plan had worked. We had managed to restore a piece of our town's soul. But in doing so, we had done something else. We had attracted the attention of whatever had stolen it in the first place. This wasn't a passive force we were fighting. It wasn't a curse. It was a conscious, intelligent entity. And now, it knew about us. The joyous roar of the crowd was a distant, meaningless sound. My world had narrowed to the dark, empty space in the alley where the figure had been. It was a vacuum of shadow and threat that had swallowed all the warmth of the beautiful autumn day. My heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. We had poked the beast. We had made a noise in the great silent library of its power, and it had turned its head to look at us. "Ethan? What is it?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," Chloe said, her voice cutting through my paralysis. Her grip on my arm tightened, her earlier elation replaced with concern. "Not a ghost," I managed to say, my voice raspy. "Something else. In the alley. Someone was watching." I described the tall, thin figure, the old-fashioned clothes, the palpable aura of malevolence that had rolled off it in waves. It wasn't happy about the mayor's speech, Chloe. It was furious. The implication settled over us, chilling the celebratory air. Our victory hadn't been a simple breakthrough, it had been an act of defiance. We hadn't just helped the town remember a word, we had stolen something back. And the original owner was angry. As we moved through the dispersing crowd, I could already hear the change we had wrought. The word Haven was tentatively on people's lips. "What a lovely festival for the Haven," Mrs. Gable said to a neighbor, the word feeling new and precious in her mouth. Two teenagers passed by, one saying, "Let's grab a pizza at the Haven Grill." The name was incomplete, a fragment of the whole, but it was being woven back into the fabric of the town's speech. Our partial success had created a new, unstable reality. It felt like progress, but given the figure I'd just seen, it also felt like we had painted a giant target on our backs. Our shared feeling of unease drove us from the happy chaos of the square. We needed the safety and silence of the library, not as a sanctuary anymore, but as a bunker. We had to understand what we were up against. Back in the familiar dust of the archives, I pulled out Silas Blackwood's journal again. We had read his words before, but we had been looking for a name. Now, we were looking for the nature of our enemy. I found the passage and read it aloud, the words taking on a sinister new weight. "The guardian of this valley does not ask for gold or prayer, only for acknowledgement." "Guardian," Chloe repeated, a scornful edge to her voice. "That thing you saw didn't look like any guardian angel I've ever heard of. It sounds more like a prison guard." "I think you're right," I said, looking at the words. Blackwood made a compact, an agreement. We saw it as a historical event, but what if it was a contract with a pre-existing entity? A local spirit, a genius loci. Something ancient that was already here when he arrived. My mind, the librarian's mind, began to collate the facts. Blackwood gave it what it wanted, acknowledgement. He named the town for it, in its honor. Havenwood. A name that paid tribute to the idea of a sanctuary, which is what this guardian provided. In return, the town prospered. But the contract had a maintenance clause. The acknowledgement had to be continuous. The town's pride, its active memory of the name, was the payment. "And we stopped paying," Chloe finished, her eyes dark with understanding. "Over the decades, as the world got bigger and our town got smaller, people's pride faded. We became apathetic. We took it for granted. The acknowledgement weakened. And the guardian got angry," I concluded. "It began to repossess its collateral. The name itself." A sudden, unnatural chill swept through the archive room. It was a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. The single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered violently, casting the room in a strobe of light and shadow. The pages of the open journal on the desk began to flutter, stirred by a non-existent wind. We both froze, watching in horror. "What's happening?" Chloe whispered. My eyes were fixed on the journal. The page we had left open, the one containing the precious, cryptic riddle, was changing. The elegant, iron gall ink of Silas Blackwood's script, which had survived for over a century, began to fade. It wasn't smudging or blurring. The letters were simply vanishing, lightening from black to gray to nothing, as if being bleached from the paper by an invisible light. It's the journal. It's erasing the riddle. I yelled, a surge of adrenaline cutting through my fear. This was a direct retaliation. The entity was destroying the very path that had led us to our discovery. It was locking the door behind us. Acting on pure instinct, Chloe lunged forward, pulling her phone from her pocket. With trembling hands, she aimed the camera at the page. "I'm not letting it take this," she said through gritted teeth. The phone's camera flashed, a stark, artificial light in the flickering gloom. She got the picture just in time. A second later, the last faint traces of the ink vanished completely. The page was now a blank canvas of aged, yellowed paper. The riddle, our first and most important clue, was gone from the physical world forever. The cold receded as quickly as it had come. The light bulb steadied, casting its weak, yellow glow over the scene of violation. I stared at the blank page, a profound sense of loss and terror washing over me. Did it work? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The photo. Chloe stared down at her phone screen, her breath held. She nodded slowly. "It's here," she said, her voice filled with a new, steely resolve. "The picture is clear. The riddle is still here." We huddled together, looking at the glowing screen. The entity's power was immense, capable of rewriting history on a physical page. But in its ancient nature, it had perhaps overlooked a modern loophole. It could erase the ink, but it hadn't erased the pixels. We had lost the original, but we had a copy. A fragile, digital ghost of a clue. We had survived the first counterattack. But the message was clear. Our enemy was not some abstract force. It was intelligent, it was vindictive, and it was now actively working to stop us. The battle for Havenwood had just become terrifyingly personal. The afterimage of the vanished words seemed burned into my retina. We stood in the archive room, the silence broken only by the frantic beating of our own hearts. The attack was over, but the message it delivered was permanent. We were not just observers in this phenomenon, we were now active combatants, and our enemy had just demonstrated its power to destroy the very ground we stood on. "It's playing defense," Chloe said, her voice a low, steady murmur that belied the fear in her eyes. She was still staring at the photo of the riddle on her phone, guarding it like a sacred text. "It knows we found its history, so it's trying to burn the book. We can't let it." A new, urgent purpose crystallized in my mind. She's right. The Blackwood collection is our only primary source. We've been treating it like a library. We need to start treating it like a witness that the other side is actively trying to silence. We have to preserve the testimony before it's gone for good. The next several hours were a frantic, desperate race against an invisible clock. We turned a corner of the archives into a makeshift digitization lab. I brought in the library's high-resolution flatbed scanner for the letters and documents, and we set up a copy stand with a digital camera for the thick, fragile journals that couldn't be laid flat. Fueled by stale coffee from the break room and a gnawing sense of dread, we began the painstaking process of creating a digital ghost of Silas Blackwood's entire life. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind against the tall windows, sent a jolt of fear through me. We worked with a hushed intensity, half expecting the lights to flicker and the unnatural cold to descend upon us again at any moment. This wasn't just archival work anymore. It was an act of defiance, a desperate attempt to build a digital fortress around a history that was under siege. It was in this state of heightened focus, poring over documents we might have otherwise skimmed, that Chloe found the next breadcrumb. She was scanning one of Blackwood's financial ledgers, a dry, monotonous record of bartered goods and land purchases. "Ethan, this is weird," she said, pointing to a recurring entry. "Look. Once a month, every month, for over 20 years. A payment. Not in cash, but in goods. Sacks of flour, cured meats, iron tools." I looked over her shoulder. The entry was listed under a strange, self-created category, Valley Tithe. And the recipient was not a name, but a single, cryptic initial. T. A tithe is a tax, usually paid to a church, I mused. But there was no church here for the first decade. This is something else. A tribute. My eyes scanned the page. Look at the dates. I'm going to cross-reference them with his personal journal. I pulled up the digital images of the journal we had already scanned. Matching the first payment date, I found the corresponding entry. Blackwood's writing was brief, almost coded. Met with T at the ridge. The peace is kept. The valley is quiet. It was the same for every payment date. A cryptic mention of a meeting with T to ensure the compact was being honored. So T wasn't the guardian, Chloe reasoned. T was a person. An intermediary. The go-between for Blackwood and whatever lives out there in the woods. Who was T? The question consumed us. An initial was almost nothing to go on, a ghost in the historical record. But in a town this small, founded by only a handful of families, it was a start. I pulled up our newly scanned image of the first ever town census, from the year after its founding. The list of family names was short. Miller, Gable, Henderson, the same names that still populated the town today. And then my eyes landed on one. Thompson. The name jolted a memory from the first day of the forgetting, a memory that seemed a lifetime ago. Sheriff Thompson. A man as integral to the town as the gazebo in the square. His family had been here since the beginning. Could it be? It was a wild, desperate leap of logic, but it was the only one we had. If the Thompson family had been the original intermediaries, it stood to reason that some knowledge, some ancestral memory or duty, might have been passed down through the generations. The current Sheriff Thompson wasn't just a man of the law, he might be the keeper of a very old, very dangerous secret. We had to talk to him. The thought was terrifying. This wasn't a late-night chat with a confused waitress. This was the chief law enforcement officer of our town. How could we even begin to explain? We decided on a cautious approach, using my role as librarian as a plausible cover. We found him the next afternoon, finishing a late lunch at the diner. The word Haven was now painted in cheerful letters on the specials board behind him. He greeted us with a tired but friendly smile. Ethan, Chloe, what can I do for you? Don't tell me I have an overdue book. Nothing like that, Sheriff, I said, trying to keep my voice even. We slid into the booth opposite him. Actually, I'm here on a historical matter. The library is putting together a new exhibit on the founding families. I was going through Blackwood's private records and saw your family name, Thompson, mentioned frequently, right from the very beginning. It seemed your ancestors had a particularly close relationship with the founder. I was wondering if there were any old family stories about it. The friendly smile on Sheriff Thompson's face didn't vanish, but it froze. It became a mask, his eyes losing their warmth and turning hard, watchful. He put his fork down slowly and deliberately. Blackwood's private records, he repeated, his voice low and devoid of its earlier folksy charm. That's deep digging, Ethan. Most of that stuff hasn't seen the light of day in a century. We're just trying to be thorough, Chloe added, her voice admirably steady. The sheriff leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on us. The friendly neighborhood cop was gone, replaced by someone else, someone older and warier. Let me give you both some advice, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of a command. There are some old stories, some old town business, that's best left buried. You're digging in places you shouldn't be. You're stirring up things that have been sleeping for a long, long time. He leaned back, the smile returning to his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. So, for the sake of this town's peace, drop it. We sat there, stunned into silence. He knew everything. The compact, the guardian, the forgetting. He wasn't just aware of the secret, he was actively protecting it. We had come looking for an ally, a descendant who might hold a key. Instead, we had found a second guardian, this one wearing a badge. And he had just drawn a line in the sand. Sheriff Thompson's words hung in the air of the diner long after he had paid his bill and departed, leaving a chill that the warm, coffee-scented atmosphere couldn't dispel. His warning hadn't been a suggestion. It was a threat, delivered with the calm, unshakable authority of a man who was used to being obeyed. We were no longer just two curious citizens who had stumbled upon a strange phenomenon. In the eyes of the law, we were now troublemakers. So, what does that mean? Chloe asked as we walked away from the diner, the cheerful chatter inside seeming to come from a different world. Is he going to arrest us for reading old books? He can't arrest us, but he can make our lives very difficult, I replied, my mind racing through the possibilities. The sheriff has influence. He can turn people against us. He can block our access. He's not the guardian, a supernatural force that erases ink. He's something more tangible, and in some ways, more dangerous. He's a human barrier. We retreated to the library, the one place that still felt remotely safe, and tried to dissect the sheriff's motivation. Was he in league with the Guardian? Was he some kind of cultist, serving a dark master? I don't think so, I said, pacing in front of the sealed archive doors. Think back to Blackwood's journal. The Thompsons' role was to keep the peace. They were the diplomats. For generations, their family's duty has likely been to maintain the delicate, terrible balance with the Guardian. Don't anger it. Keep it placated. Pay the tithe. And the tithe was the town's active acknowledgement of its name, Chloe picked up the thread. When that faded, the Guardian got angry and started the erasure. Exactly, I said. From the sheriff's point of view, the forgetting is the lesser of two evils. It's a slow, quiet decay, but it's peaceful. No one panics because no one knows what they've lost. He sees it as a stable, manageable situation. But us, we're trying to wake the town up. We're poking the ancient entity with a stick. He's not protecting the Guardian. He's trying to protect the town from the Guardian's full wrath by enforcing the status quo. He was a man who had inherited a terrible duty, to keep the monster in the valley asleep. And we had just walked into its cave and started shouting. Over the next couple of days, we saw the effects of our actions rippling through the town. The partial name, Haven, had stuck. It was on everyone's lips, a comforting, familiar word. But it also created a subtle, pervasive unease. It was like a phantom limb. People could feel that something else was supposed to be attached to it. I overheard conversations in the grocery store. Haven. It's a nice word. But don't you feel like you're only saying half of it? The town was no longer sleeping peacefully in its amnesia. It was now tossing and turning, caught in a half-waking dream, and this disquiet was precisely what the sheriff feared. His response came on a Wednesday morning. He walked into the library, not with the cold menace from the diner, but with his official public servant face on. He was accompanied by two men from the town's public works department. "Morning, Ethan," he said, his tone polite but firm. "We were reviewing the safety records for some of the older municipal buildings, and the library's archive wing came up. The wiring in there is over 50 years old, and frankly, the floor joists aren't rated for the weight of all that paper. It's a fire hazard and a potential collapse risk." My blood ran cold. I knew exactly what was happening. "I'm afraid," he continued, pulling out a roll of yellow caution tape, "that for the safety of the public and yourself, I have to declare this area officially off limits. We'll have to keep it sealed until the county can budget for an engineer to come out and do a full structural assessment. You know how budgets are. It could be a while." He wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling the truth. He was using the slow, grinding gears of bureaucracy as his weapon. He watched as his men stretched the yellow tape across the archive room door. Each strip of tape was a bar on a cage, locking us away from the Blackwood collection, from the physical evidence, from the heart of our investigation. He gave me a nod that was almost apologetic, the look of a man doing a dirty job that he felt was necessary. Then he left. Chloe arrived a few minutes later, coffee in hand, and stopped dead, staring at the sealed door. "You've got to be kidding me," she breathed, her face a mask of fury. "He shut us down." We stood there for a long time, the caution tape a screaming yellow symbol of our defeat. The sheriff had outmaneuvered us completely. He had cut off our supply line, neutralized our base of operations, and he'd done it all with a smile and a safety ordinance. It was a brilliant, devastating move. "What do we do now?" I said, the words heavy with despair. "Everything we need is in there." Chloe was quiet for a moment, her eyes scanning the sealed door. Then, a slow, defiant smile spread across her face. She looked at me, and her eyes were glittering. "He's smart," she said. "But he's from another time. He thinks the fight is about dusty papers and old leather books. He locked the door to the castle." She held up her phone, the screen showing a photo of the riddle. "But he doesn't realize we already digitized the crown jewels and smuggled them out." Her gaze shifted from her phone to the unassuming beige box of the library's main server, humming quietly in my office. "The physical journals are trapped," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But the information is still free. He can't put caution tape around a hard drive." A wave of renewed hope washed over me, chasing away the despair. We were cornered. We were targeted. But we weren't beaten. The sheriff had forced us out of the light, but he had also shown us where we needed to go. "We have to move the files," I said, my mind already formulating a new plan. "We can't work here. He'll be watching. We need to copy everything to a laptop, take it somewhere safe." The investigation was over. The rebellion had just begun. The yellow caution tape on the archive door was more than just a barrier, it was a declaration of war. Sheriff Thompson had made his move, and in doing so, had changed the rules of the game entirely. We were no longer researchers, we were dissidents. Our quiet quest for knowledge had become a clandestine operation. That night, the library was not a sanctuary. It was enemy territory. We worked in the dim light of my office computer's monitor, a single island of light in a sea of encroaching shadows. The air was thick with paranoia. Every passing car on Main Street sounded like the sheriff's cruiser coming to check on us. The groan of the old building settling felt like the approach of the Guardian itself. Our task was simple, but the weight of it was immense. We initiated the transfer of the entire Blackwood digital archive, every scanned journal page, every letter, every ledger, from the library's vulnerable server to a new, encrypted external hard drive. It was a massive amount of data, the sum total of a man's life and a town's founding secrets, and it was trickling through the Ethernet cable at a painfully slow pace. The progress bar on the screen became our lifeline and our tormentor. "This feels like a heist," Chloe whispered, her eyes glued to the screen. She was perched on the edge of a chair, coiled with nervous energy. "It is," I replied, watching the front door. "We're stealing back our own history." As the final file copied over, a wave of relief so profound it almost made me dizzy washed over me. I ejected the hard drive, its small, dense weight feeling like a sacred relic in my hand. We had it. We had our fortress, and it was portable. We couldn't leave together. It would look too suspicious if anyone was watching. I gave the hard drive, our primary evidence, to Chloe. I would take the laptop with a second copy. We would be the redundant backups for our town's soul. "Where do we go?" I asked. "We can't work at my place, or yours. The sheriff knows where we live." Chloe had already thought it through. "My grandmother's house," she said. "The old gable place on Elm Street. We can use the attic. No one has been up there in 20 years, least of all Grandma. It's perfect. It's the last place anyone would think to look." Her grandmother was Martha Gable, the kind-hearted baker I had spoken to on the first day of the forgetting. It felt like a fitting, full-circle twist of fate. We left the library a half-hour apart. The short walk through the quiet, sleeping town felt like crossing a border into a new, more dangerous country. I met Chloe in the backyard of the old Victorian house, a place that smelled of rose bushes and damp earth. She led me in through the back door and up a narrow, creaking set of stairs hidden away in a linen closet. The attic was exactly as she described it, a vast, low-ceilinged space filled with the ghosts of a family's past. Furniture draped in white sheets stood like silent, lumpy specters. Cardboard boxes overflowing with old photographs and letters were stacked high. The air was thick with the smell of cedar, dust, and time. It was a physical archive of memories, a perfect hideout for our digital one. In the center of the attic, under the single dusty round window that looked out over the town, we cleared a space. We ran an extension cord from the floor below, set up an old card table and 2 rickety chairs, and placed the laptop upon it. This small circle of light in the immense, cluttered darkness was our new headquarters, the nerve center of the Haven resistance. For the first time in days, we could breathe. We were safe. We were hidden. Now, the real work could begin. "Okay," Chloe said, pulling up a chair. "We know the name is Havenwood. We know the Guardian is angry, and we know the sheriff is trying to keep a lid on everything. What's the next question?" "The next question is how we win," I said, leaning over the laptop. Knowing the name isn't enough. Restoring half of it, Haven, only made the Guardian and the sheriff angry. We need to restore the second half. Wood. And we need to understand why that half was the first to be forgotten. We began to meticulously comb through the digital archive again. This time, we weren't just looking for a name or a person. We were looking for rules. Weaknesses. The fine print of Silas Blackwood's ancient contract. The clue came from an unexpected place. A scanned letter Blackwood had written to his brother in Boston, a man far outside the Guardian's sphere of influence. In it, he wrote not as a proud founder, but as a worried man. "The compact I have made for this town is a delicate balance," the letter read. "The prosperity it grants is real, but the price is eternal vigilance. The guardian of this valley is an old and territorial power, tied inextricably to the old wood. Its strength is in the deep forest, its spirit is in the ancient trees. As long as we honor that forest, as long as we treat it as a partner and not a possession, our haven here will be secure. We must be a part of the woods, not its master." The phrase leaped from the screen. "Tied to the old wood." "Chloe," I said, my voice electric with discovery. "Look, Havenwood. It's not just a name. It's the 2 halves of the compact." Her eyes widened as she read the passage. "Haven is our part," she said, thinking it through. "To build a shelter for people. A community." "And wood was the Guardian's part," I finished, the full picture coming into focus with stunning clarity. The name was a constant reminder of the bargain. We were the people of the Haven in the wood. We were meant to honor the forest, to respect the source of the Guardian's power. And we broke the deal. It was obvious, now that we saw it. The town had forgotten the second half of its name because it had forgotten the second half of its promise. I thought of the new housing development that had clear-cut a swath of the forest on the lower slopes of Old Man's Ridge a decade ago. I thought of the old logging road that had been widened, scarring the landscape. We hadn't been malicious. We had just been modern. We had seen the forest as a resource, not a partner. And in our forgetfulness, we had severed our connection to the wood, making that part of our name meaningless, powerless, and the first to be erased. A new, daunting understanding settled over us. To fully restore the name, we had to do more than just remind people of a word. We had to fix the broken promise. We had to make amends for a century of neglect. I looked out the dusty attic window, past the warm lights of the sleeping town, to the immense, dark silhouette of the forest and the ridge. Our investigation had, until now, been confined to books and archives and conversations. But the answers we needed weren't in the town anymore. They were out there, in the deep, quiet woods, in the heart of our enemy's territory. The attic, once a simple hiding place, had transformed into our sanctuary, our war room, and our library all in one. The revelation that Havenwood was not just a name but the two clauses of a broken contract had changed everything. We were no longer just fighting against a forgetting, we were trying to atone for one. We had a new, terrifyingly abstract mission. How do you apologize to an ancient, vengeful entity for a century of neglect? We can't just walk out there and say, "We're sorry," Chloe said, pacing the small, clear patch of floorboards between boxes. The Guardian isn't going to listen to reason. Blackwood called it a power, not a person. It understands actions, not words. Then we need to find the right action, I agreed, turning back to the glowing laptop screen. Blackwood maintained the peace for decades. He must have done more than just pay a tithe of goods to his intermediary. He must have had a way of dealing with the Guardian directly. A ritual, a tradition. Our search through the digital archive became more focused. We weren't looking for names or dates, but for patterns and rituals. We scanned Blackwood's journals for any mention of the woods, the ridge, or the valley that seemed ceremonial. The clue, when we found it, was not in his words, but in a simple sketch. Tucked into the back of his very last journal, on a page that was otherwise blank, was a hand-drawn map. It was a crude but detailed rendering of the path from the town square up to the summit of Old Man's Ridge. At the peak, he had drawn a small circle of what looked like standing stones. Next to the sketch was a cryptic, three-word note: "Renew the Heartwood." Heartwood is the central, strongest wood of a tree, I mused, zooming in on the image. To renew the heartwood, it sounds like an act of restoration, of planting something new. Chloe pointed to the starting point of the map on the sketch. He started his path at the town square. What's in the middle of the town square? The gazebo, I answered immediately, then corrected myself. No, the gazebo was built later. Before that, in the very center, was the Founder's Oak. The Founder's Oak was a town legend, a massive, sprawling oak tree that was said to have been planted by Silas Blackwood himself on the day of the town's founding. It was the living heart of our community, a piece of the wood brought into the center of the haven. Wait a minute, I said, a theory taking shape. What if Blackwood's ritual, the way he renewed the heartwood, was symbolic? What if he took a sapling grown from an acorn of the Founder's Oak and replanted it back in a sacred spot in the forest, reaffirming the connection? A cyclical offering, returning a piece of the wood to the wild to honor the compact. It felt right. It was a powerful, symbolic act of balance. And it was an action we could replicate. Our mission was suddenly clear, tangible, and terrifying. We had to take a sapling from the Founder's Oak, climb to the summit of the ridge, and perform a ritual of renewal in the heart of the Guardian's territory. The obstacles were immediate and immense. First, the sheriff. We were being watched. The town square was the most public, open space in the entire community. We couldn't just march in there with a shovel in broad daylight. Second, the Guardian. If it had attacked us in the library, what would it do to us when we were standing in its most sacred place? We'll need a diversion, Chloe said, her mind already shifting to logistics. We have to get the sheriff to the opposite end of town. And we have to do this when there are no witnesses. The plan we formulated was fraught with risk. Chloe would use a burner app on her phone to place an anonymous, but urgent-sounding, emergency call, reporting a transformer explosion and a power outage out by the old lumber mill, a call that would take the sheriff a good 20 minutes to get to and verify. The call had to be timed perfectly. We would move in the dead of night, under the cover of darkness. The hours leading up to our planned mission were the longest of my life. We stayed in the attic, watching the town through the single-round window, tracking the sheriff's patrol patterns. At 2 a.m., when the town was wrapped in its deepest silence, it was time. We slipped out of the house like shadows, carrying a small spade and a burlap sack. The town was eerily quiet, the only sound our own soft footsteps on the pavement. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like an approaching threat. When we reached the edge of the town square, we crouched in the bushes, our hearts pounding. The Founder's Oak was a colossal, ancient silhouette against the faint glow of the night sky. It felt like we were about to commit a sacrilege against the one living thing that had stood as a silent witness to our entire history. "Okay," Chloe whispered, her phone in her hand. "I'm making the call now." We waited, every second stretching into an eternity. A few minutes later, we heard the distant siren of the sheriff's cruiser as it sped away, towards the old lumber mill on the far side of town. It was our chance. We ran to the base of the great oak. Finding a sapling was easy. A handful of them grew in the shade of the parent tree, protected and nurtured. I chose a small, healthy-looking one and began to dig carefully into the soft earth, my hands shaking. The sound of the spade slicing into the dirt was deafening in the silence. We worked quickly, loosening the soil around the young tree's roots. As I gently lifted the sapling from the ground, a profound sense of significance washed over me. This small, vulnerable plant, with its handful of leaves and a delicate root ball, was the physical embodiment of our hope. It was the apology we were about to offer. Just as Chloe was wrapping the roots in the damp burlap sack, we heard it. The sound of a car engine. Headlights cut through the darkness at the far end of Main Street, moving slowly in our direction. "It's him," I hissed. The diversion didn't hold him long enough. We grabbed the sapling and scrambled back into the deep shadows of a thick hedge, pressing ourselves flat against the ground. The cruiser rolled slowly past the square, its spotlight beam sweeping across the gazebo, the benches, the base of the great oak. The light passed just inches over our heads. We held our breath, certain we would be discovered. After a moment that felt like a lifetime, the car continued on its patrol and disappeared around the corner. We remained frozen for another full minute before daring to move. We had the sapling. We had escaped, but just barely. The sheriff was vigilant. Back in the attic, we placed the young oak in a bucket of soil. It stood there, a fragile symbol of a promise we were about to renew. We had the offering. We had the map from Blackwood's journal. And we knew our destination. The sun would be rising in just a few hours. Our journey to the stony summit of the ridge, into the Guardian's lair, was about to begin. The pre-dawn air was cold and sharp as we slipped out of the sleeping gable house. The town of Haven was a landscape of soft, gray shadows, its new partial name a whispered secret held in the quiet streets. In my hands, I carefully cradled the sapling, its small cluster of roots wrapped in damp burlap. This fragile piece of life felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the fate of our entire community. We were no longer hiding or researching. We were pilgrims on a desperate, sacred quest. Crossing the boundary from the last paved street into the dark maw of the forest was like stepping into another world. The temperature dropped instantly. The ambient, gentle hum of the town was swallowed by a profound and unnerving silence. This was the Guardian's territory, the wood half of our broken name, and we could feel its consciousness press in on us from all sides. It was a heavy ancient watchfulness, the feeling of being an unwelcome thought in a vast and hostile mind. We used a small penlight to consult the digital image of Blackwood's map on Chloe's phone, its modern glow a tiny, defiant spark against the primordial darkness. The path started clearly enough, a faint trail used by hikers, but the deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to resist us. The first trial was disorientation. The path, which should have been a steady upward climb, began to feel circular. Trees that should have been landmarks seemed to shift their positions. A distinctive, lightning-scarred pine we passed once seemed to reappear on our left a few minutes later. "This isn't right," I whispered, my voice tight with anxiety. "We should be gaining elevation faster. It feels like we're walking in circles." My logical mind, which craved order and predictability, was beginning to fray at the edges. "Don't trust your eyes," Chloe said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the disorienting dark. She stopped and looked up, past the thick canopy, searching for a break in the leaves. "There. The North Star. The ridge is west of town, so we keep that star over our right shoulder and just keep climbing. Ignore the path. The forest is lying to us." Her pragmatism cut through the supernatural fog. We left the treacherous path and began to push our way directly through the undergrowth, the terrain growing steeper and more difficult. The Guardian's second assault was more direct, more personal. It began to use our own fears as weapons. A sound drifted through the trees, faint but unmistakable, the distant wail of a police siren. My heart leaped into my throat. The sheriff. He'd found us. But the sound was wrong. It didn't fade or grow louder. It just hung in the air, a perfect, tormenting loop designed to prey on our paranoia. "It's not real," Chloe insisted, grabbing my arm. "It's a trick. Keep moving." Then came the whispers. They were like the rustle of dry leaves, but with a sibilant, intelligent edge. They seemed to slither around us, weaving through the trees, almost forming our names. They were sounds of mockery and menace, designed to unnerve and divide us. I felt a cold dread, a primal fear of being hunted, that was entirely separate from my fear of the sheriff. The Guardian's final trick was physical. As we scrambled up a steep embankment, a sudden, thick fog rolled in, descending upon us with unnatural speed. It was a dense, clammy blanket that reduced our visibility to nothing, muffling sound and swallowing the beam of our flashlight. We were blind, suffocating in a sea of gray. At the same time, we heard a tremendous cracking sound from directly ahead, followed by a heavy, ground-shaking thud. We froze, peering into the impenetrable mist. When the fog thinned slightly a moment later, we saw that a massive, rotted tree had fallen directly in our path, its bulk completely blocking our way forward. It was an ancient, moss-covered giant that must have been dead for a century, yet it had fallen now, in this exact spot. It was not an act of nature. It was a command. Go back. For a moment, despair washed over me. We were lost, blind, and our way was barred. We can't get over that, I said, my voice cracking. We're not going over it, Chloe said, her jaw set in a line of pure defiance. We're going through it. She pointed at the base of the tree. The wood was so old and decayed that it was soft and pulpy. Without another word, she began to claw at it, tearing away handfuls of damp, crumbling wood. I stared at her for a second, then my own resolve hardened. I carefully set the sapling down and joined her, digging and tearing at the rotten trunk. We worked like frantic animals, ignoring the splinters and the grime, our fear transmuting into a burning, furious determination. We carved a narrow, tunnel-like hole through the base of the fallen giant, and one by one, we crawled through to the other side, dragging the precious sapling with us. We emerged, covered in dirt and sweat, but we were through. We had faced the Guardian's barriers and had refused to yield. As we continued our climb, a subtle shift occurred. The whispers faded. The oppressive feeling lessened slightly. It was as if, by passing its trials, we had earned a measure of grudging respect. The first hint of dawn was staining the eastern sky when we finally broke through the last line of trees. We stood, exhausted and scratched, on the rocky wind-swept summit of the ridge. The view was breathtaking. Our town, our haven, was a small, sleeping collection of lights nestled in the valley below. And there, in the center of the summit, was the place from Blackwood's map. A circle of tall, gray monoliths, silent and ancient, like the teeth of a forgotten god. The Standing Stones. The air here was different, clear, still, and humming with a raw, neutral power. The malevolence of the forest was gone, replaced by a sense of immense, waiting solemnity. We had made it. We walked to the center of the circle of stones, the sapling held between us. The sky was turning from purple to a soft, hopeful orange. We were ready. But as the first direct ray of sunlight struck the face of the tallest stone, a shadow detached itself from the monolith opposite us. It was a long, thin sliver of darkness that coalesced and solidified into a familiar, terrifying shape. The tall, thin figure in the dark, old-fashioned clothes stood before us. The Guardian was here. It had been waiting for us. The time for trials in the dark was over. The time for a reckoning in the light had begun. We stood frozen in the center of the ancient stone circle, the fragile sapling clutched between us. The being that coalesced from the shadows was a tear in the fabric of the morning, a pillar of darkness against the hopeful glow of the dawn. It was tall and unervingly thin, its form shifting and indistinct, as though it were woven from smoke and memory. It wore the silhouette of a man in old-fashioned clothes, but there was no face, no features, only a profound, crushing void where a face should be. We could feel its immense, ancient consciousness focused on us, a pressure that felt like the weight of a deep ocean. It did not speak with a voice. The words bloomed directly in our minds, cold and sharp as shards of ice. Thieves. You crawl into my heart and bring with you a splinter of the disease. A dead thing from a dead place. The attack was immediate, contemptuous. It saw our offering not as a gift, but as a contamination. Its chilling gaze, which we felt more than saw, fell upon the young oak sapling. It's not a dead thing, I found myself speaking aloud, my voice trembling but clear in the thin mountain air. My words felt small and foolish, but I needed to hear a human sound in the face of its silent, mental assault. It's a promise. The Guardian's response was a wave of pure, dismissive scorn. It showed us images, flashing through our minds with brutal clarity. We saw Silas Blackwood, his face etched with worry, signing the compact. We saw the initial prosperity, the town growing. Then, the images soured. We saw the first logging operations, the old trees falling. We saw the chemical runoff from the old mill turning the river's silver tone to a murky brown. We saw the new housing development, its pavements sealing the earth. We saw generations of townspeople who no longer walked in the woods, who had forgotten the feel of soil under their feet, who had forgotten the second half of their name and their promise. The promise was broken, the guardian's thoughts pressed into us. The debt of acknowledgement was unpaid. The compact is void. The forgetting is not a punishment. It is a repossession. I am unmaking what was built on a lie. I am taking back my valley. Its logic was cold, simple, and in its own terrible way, just. The town had broken the contract. The erasure was the consequence. There was no malice in its actions, only an ancient, implacable sense of order being restored. How could we argue against that? We couldn't. You're right, I said, meeting the faceless void with as much courage as I could muster. The admission seemed to surprise it. The pressure in our minds lessened for a fraction of a second. The town forgot. We broke the promise. We are not here to make excuses. We are here to apologize. And to begin again. As I spoke, Chloe moved. It was a small, decisive action of pure, defiant faith. She knelt, setting the base of the sapling on the ground, and began to dig into the soft earth at the very center of the stone circle with a small spade. The scrape of metal on soil was the only real sound on the mountaintop. It was an answer more powerful than any of my words. The guardian turned its full, terrible attention to her. The pressure returned, 100 times stronger, no longer a simple statement, but a vicious, targeted assault. Beginning again is an illusion for mortals. There is only the end. It flooded our minds with visions of failure, weaponizing our deepest fears. I was hit with an image of the library, my library, engulfed in flames, a century of knowledge turning to ash. I saw the faces of my friends and neighbors, their eyes vacant, not even recognizing their own children. The final forgetting. Beside me, I felt Chloe gasp. I knew, without seeing, what the guardian was showing her. She saw her grandmother, Martha Gable, sitting in a chair, her kind face empty, unable to remember her own name or the granddaughter who cared for her. It showed her the diner, boarded up and abandoned. It showed her a future of absolute loss. Chloe's hands faltered. The digging stopped. Her shoulders began to shake. The psychic assault was too much, too cruel. Chloe, don't look, I said, kneeling beside her, putting my hand on her shoulder. I closed my own eyes, trying to block out the horrific images, and forced my mind to focus on the one shield I had, the founder's intent. I began to recite the words from his journal, the words that had started this all. The compact is a delicate balance. As long as we honor the forest, our haven will be secure, a shelter for hard-working folk. I was using Blackwood's own words, the foundation of the very compact it was enforcing, as a defense. The psychic pressure wavered, as if confused by this tactic. Chloe took a shuddering breath, then another. Her resolve hardened. I'm not letting you win, she gritted out, and began to dig again, each movement a blow against the despair the guardian was forcing upon us. Together, we finished the small hole. Together, we lowered the sapling into the earth. Our hands were side by side as we pushed the soil back around its delicate roots, securing it in the sacred ground. At the exact moment that our hands pressed the last of the earth into place, the sun finally crested the distant mountains. A brilliant, clean ray of golden light shot across the valley and struck the circle of stones. It hit the small, brave sapling, and an impossible thing happened. A pulse of warm, golden energy erupted from the young tree. It was not a violent explosion, but a gentle, silent wave of pure life and renewed promise. It washed over us, cleansing the psychic filth from our minds and replacing it with a profound sense of peace and hope. The wave of light struck the guardian. The dark figure recoiled as if it had been physically burned, a silent, piercing scream of agony echoing in our thoughts. Its form, already unstable, began to unravel, the shadows that composed it fraying at the edges. The sunlight, amplified and focused by the ritual, was poison to it. It was not destroyed, but it was beaten back. As it dissolved into the lengthening shadows of the monoliths, its final parting thought lashed out at us, a promise and a curse. This changes nothing. The debt is too great. The scar remains. And then it was gone. We were alone on the sun-drenched summit, kneeling in the dirt, our hands still resting on the earth around the newly planted sapling. It stood proudly in the morning light, its leaves almost glowing. We had done it. We had faced the guardian and renewed the heartwood. We looked at each other, exhausted, filthy, and emotionally shattered. Then we looked down at our town, bathed in the gentle morning sun. Had anything changed? Was this enough? We had planted a seed of hope in the heart of our enemy's power, but we had no way of knowing if it was enough to stop the slow, inevitable decay of our home. We stood on the sun-drenched summit, the world silent save for the wind whistling past the ancient stones. The Guardian was gone, its chilling presence replaced by the clean, crisp air of the new morning. Before us, the sapling stood, a tiny defiant flag of life planted in the heart of a place that had been ruled by a dark and ancient power. We had faced our dragon. But the Guardian's parting words echoed in our minds, a venomous whisper that tainted our victory. This changes nothing. The debt is too great. The scar remains. The journey down the mountain was the inverse of our ascent. Where before the path had twisted and the woods had pressed in on us with a suffocating malevolence, now the forest was simply a forest. The trees were just trees. The path that had been obscured was now clear, leading us steadily downwards. The whispers and illusions were gone, replaced by the natural, peaceful sounds of birdsong and the rustle of squirrels in the undergrowth. The Guardian's active hostile influence over the land had been broken, or at least forced into dormancy. It was the first sign that our desperate ritual had not been in vain. But as we emerged from the tree lean and walked back into the waking town, a heavy sense of disappointment began to settle over me. It was a normal morning in Haven. People were getting into their cars to go to work. Children were waiting for the school bus. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted from the diner. Everything was exactly as it had been. I listened intently to the conversations around us. "Have a good day at the Haven Elementary School," a mother called to her son. "I'll pick you up from the Haven Library after work," a man said into his phone. The partial name was still there. The would had not magically reappeared in their vocabulary. Had we gone through all that terror and effort just to maintain the new, broken status quo? "It didn't work," I said to Chloe, my voice flat. The exhaustion of the last 24 hours crashed down on me, mingled with a bitter sense of failure. "We don't know that yet," she countered, though her own face was clouded with doubt. "The Guardian said the scar remains. A scar isn't a fresh wound. It's a healed-over injury. Maybe the healing is just slow." We retreated to the attic, our secret, dusty sanctuary. We were too wired to sleep, too uncertain to feel any sense of triumph. There was one test, and one test only, that would tell us if we had truly changed anything. The active censorship. The magical erasure of the word itself. I pulled a blank sheet of paper from a box of old stationery and picked up a pen. My hand trembled, not from fear this time, but from the sheer weight of anticipation. For weeks, this simple act had been an impossibility. I took a deep breath, placed the nib of the pen on the paper, and began to write. The H formed, then the I. My heart hammered in my chest. V-E-N. This far I had been able to get before. I pushed forward, expecting the ink to fail, the letters to dissolve into meaningless squiggles. But they didn't. The W formed, crisp and clear. Then O-O-D. There it was, spelled out in my own shaky handwriting, solid and real and undeniable. Havenwood. I stared at the word, a laugh bubbling up from my chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Chloe grabbed the pen from my hand and wrote it herself, again and again, as if to prove it was real. Havenwood. 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 We had done it. We had broken the curse. The supernatural enforcement was gone. The word was free. Our elation lasted for a full hour before the next, more complicated problem settled in. The magic was broken, but the memory was not. An entire town was still suffering from a collective amnesia that had spanned generations. The name wasn't being suppressed anymore, but it hadn't been restored. The town was a patient cured of a disease, but now it had to learn to walk again. And our biggest obstacle was no longer a supernatural entity, but a man with a badge. Sheriff Thompson. "We have to talk to him," I said, the decision solidifying as I spoke it. "We can't do this without him. Trying to re-educate the whole town while its chief of police is actively working against us is impossible." This time, we walked into his office at the small police station. We didn't ask questions. We came with proof. He was sitting at his desk, doing paperwork, and he looked up at us with a weary, guarded expression. He clearly was not happy to see us. "I thought I made myself clear," he began, his voice dangerously low. "I didn't say a word. I simply walked to his desk, took the notepad that sat next to his phone, and picked up his pen. He watched me, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. And then, in plain, clear letters, I wrote the name on his own notepad. Havenwood. The sheriff stared at the word. The blood drained from his face. He looked from the notepad to me and then back again. I could see him processing the impossible. This was an act that should not have been able to happen in his world. He had lived his entire life by a set of terrible, unbreakable rules, and we had just broken the most fundamental one right in front of him. "How?" he finally whispered, the single word a mix of awe, anger, and terror. "We renewed the compact," I said softly. "We made the offering. The curse on the word is broken." "You fools," he breathed, standing up from his desk. He wasn't yelling. It was worse. His voice was filled with a deep, ancestral fear. "You have no idea what you've done. You think this is a victory? The Guardian is not a ghost you can just exorcise. It's the valley itself. Its anger is in the bedrock. The forgetting was the price for peace. The Guardian's final words to us were a threat, Sheriff. The debt remains. The scar remains. And hiding from it won't fix it," Chloe shot back, her voice firm. "We can't live in a town with a hole in its soul just because we're afraid. The people here deserve their history back. They deserve their full name." A long, tense silence filled the small office. The sheriff looked at the name on his notepad, his expression a conflict of a lifetime of duty and a new, unwelcome sliver of hope. "The town isn't ready," he finally said, shaking his head. "You can't just spring this on them. It would cause panic. Fear. I can't allow it." He wasn't going to help us. But I noticed he also didn't threaten to arrest us. His certainty was shattered. He was lost. I knew then that we couldn't force this. The town's healing had to be as gentle as its forgetting had been insidious. A new plan formed in my mind, a librarian's plan. "We won't cause a panic," I said to the sheriff. "We won't put up a new sign tomorrow. We're going to do this slowly. We're going to do it with stories." I looked him in the eye. "I'm going to create a new exhibit at the library. The full story of our founder. I'll use the digital records. I'll tell the story of the compact, of the promise, of the real meaning of our home. And I will use its full, proper name. We won't shout it at them. We'll simply invite them in to learn, to remember, at their own pace. We will heal this town with the truth." The sheriff didn't agree, but he didn't refuse. He just sank back into his chair, a weary, defeated man caught between a broken past and an uncertain future. For us, the path was finally clear. We would fight the scar of forgetting not with magic or rituals, but with knowledge. We would give our town its name back, one story at a time. Our victory in the sheriff's office felt fragile, like a truce signed on a battlefield where the war was not yet over. We had his reluctant neutrality, but not his support. His final weary look was a clear warning. If our plan backfired, he would be there to contain the damage. The responsibility for what came next rested squarely on our shoulders. We didn't waste a moment. The attic became a flurry of activity, but this time it was not the tense, paranoid work of fugitives. It was the focused, hopeful work of curators, of storytellers. We were crafting the most important exhibit our town had ever seen, and our primary source material was the digital archive we had fought so hard to protect. I handled the narrative, weaving together the disparate threads from Silas Blackwood's journals, letters, and ledgers into a coherent, compelling story. I started the exhibit with the familiar, the comfortable, the story of our haven. I wanted to invite people in, not shock them at the door. I selected passages that spoke of Blackwood's dream of a sanctuary, his respect for the pioneers who built the town alongside him. Chloe, with her keen eye for design and her intuitive understanding of how people think, handled the visual layout. She arranged the historical photographs, created compelling graphics from the old maps, and insisted that the centerpiece of the entire exhibit be a large, beautifully lit photograph of the wooden carving. "People need to see the symbol first," she argued. "They need to connect the feeling they got during the festival with the history you're showing them." The final section of the exhibit was the most delicate. We titled it, "A Broken Promise, a Name Remembered." Here, I gently introduced the concept of the compact, using Blackwood's own words about honoring the forest. We included historical photos of the logging operations and the clear-cutting for the new developments, not as an indictment, but as a simple, factual account of our town's changing priorities. And then, at the very end, on a single clean white panel in large, elegant letters, we presented the truth. Our founder's name for this special place was not just a label, but a complete idea. A two-part promise. A shelter for its people, and a partner to the forest. A haven in the wood. Our home is Havenwood. There was no grand opening, no ribbon-cutting ceremony. One Tuesday morning, we simply took down the new fiction display at the library's entrance and put up the exhibit. A simple sign invited people in, the full story of our founding. A new exhibit. The first visitor was Mr. Henderson from the hardware store, coming in to return a book on woodworking. He paused at the exhibit, his curiosity piqued. I watched from my desk as he slowly made his way through the displays. He spent a long time looking at the photo of the carving. I saw his brow furrow as he read about the compact. And then I saw him stop in front of the final panel. He stood there for a full minute, utterly still. He read the name, Havenwood, and then a slow nod of understanding rippled through his entire body. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine across the library, and gave me a small, thoughtful smile. It wasn't a look of shock or confusion. It was a look of profound, quiet satisfaction. The look of a man who had just found a precious thing he hadn't even realized he was missing. Word began to spread, not like a fire, but like the slow, warm light of dawn. Martha Gable came in that afternoon. She walked through the exhibit, her hand often rising to her mouth. When she got to the end, she had tears in her eyes. "Oh," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Of course. Havenwood. It sounds like a song I used to know." Sheriff Thompson never came inside. But for the rest of the week, I would see his cruiser parked across the street for long periods, just watching. He was observing the people going in and coming out, gauging their reactions, waiting for the panic he was so certain would erupt. But there was no panic. There was only a quiet, spreading sense of relief. Chloe heard it at the diner. The name started as a hesitant murmur. "Did you see the exhibit? About Havenwood?" Then it grew more confident. "The Havenwood High School football team has a game on Friday." The children, brought in by their teachers, adopted it with the easy, unburdened acceptance of youth. They wrote it on their school papers and shouted it in the playground. They were the first generation in a century who would grow up knowing the town's full name. But the Guardian's curse, though broken, had left a deep wound. Its parting words, "The scar remains," began to manifest. Some of the older residents, especially those who had lived in town their entire lives, would experience strange moments of cognitive dissonance. A man would be in the middle of saying, "Havenwood," and would suddenly clutch his head, a sharp headache forcing him to stop. An older woman would get a haunted, distant look in her eyes, a fleeting moment of the old forgetting washing over her before it receded. The scar was real. Decades of magical suppression had damaged the collective consciousness, and the pathways of memory were tender, easily inflamed. The healing was happening, but it was not without pain. The true, frightening nature of that scar became clear a week later. I was in my office when my phone rang. It was Chloe, and her voice was tight with panic. "It's my grandmother," she said, her words tumbling out. She was fine all morning, talking about Havenwood, telling me old stories it had reminded her of. Then, an hour ago, she just stopped. She got this awful, confused look on her face. Ethan, she didn't know who I was. She didn't know her own name. All she would do was rock back and forth and mumble the same thing over and over. "What did she say?" I asked, a cold dread seeping into my bones. Chloe took a shaky breath. She kept saying, "There's still a debt. The Valley's debt isn't paid." I closed my eyes. The Guardian's final threat was not just a parting shot of malice. It was a statement of fact. The ritual on the ridge, the apology, had been a crucial down payment. It had been enough to free the name. But it had not settled the account. The psychic scar that afflicted the town, and that had just stolen Martha Gable's memory, was the interest on a debt that was still outstanding. Our work was not done. To truly heal our town, we had to figure out what the final payment was, and how in the world we were going to pay it. The joyous relief of our victory was horrifyingly short-lived. Chloe's panicked phone call shattered the fragile peace we had just begun to enjoy. I rushed over to the Gable house to find a scene of quiet, heartbreaking confusion. Martha Gable, the warm, vibrant woman who was the unofficial heart of our town, was sitting in her favorite armchair, her eyes wide and vacant. She was staring at Chloe, the granddaughter she adored, with the polite, distant gaze of a stranger. "Hello, dear," she would say every few minutes, her voice a thin echo of its usual strength. "Have you seen Martha? I seem to have misplaced her." Chloe was holding her hand, her face pale and streaked with tears. "I'm right here, Grandma. It's me, Chloe." But the recognition wasn't there. And between these moments of placid confusion, she would begin to rock back and forth, her hands twisting in her lap, her voice dropping to a low, distressed mumble. "The debt," she would whisper, her eyes focused on a past only she could see. "The Valley's debt isn't paid. The scar is so deep." Watching her, I understood with chilling certainty that the Guardian's final threat was not just a curse, but a diagnosis. The scar wasn't just a metaphor for a painful memory. It was a real, psychic wound on the collective soul of Havenwood. In the town's most vulnerable members, the elderly, who held the deepest and oldest ties to this place, that scar was now festering. Martha was a canary in our town's coal mine, and she was suffocating. We had to act. Chloe arranged for a neighbor to stay with her grandmother, and we retreated to the attic, our mission now charged with a desperate, personal urgency. This was no longer about restoring a historical name. This was about saving Martha. Her words have to be the key, Chloe said, her voice raw with emotion as we booted up the laptop. The Valley's debt isn't paid. It's what the Guardian said, too. We paid something on that summit, but we didn't pay it all. We need to find the original bill. Our search through the digital archive began again, but with a new, frantic focus. We weren't looking for rituals or names. We were looking for a price. A cost. We searched the files for words like debt, payment, price, and contract. The search led us to a section of the archive we had previously overlooked, a series of scanned pages from a thin, separate ledger that Blackwood had simply labeled Valley Account. It was not a record of finances, but of the compact's terms. Much of it was what we already knew, the promise of prosperity in exchange for acknowledgement. But one page, written in a cramped, serious hand, laid out the second, crucial condition. The Guardian's power is the wood, Blackwood had written. Its heart is the oldest grove, the place of the standing stones on the summit. This is not land to be owned, but a sanctuary to be honored. As a perpetual sign of this compact, this sacred grove and the ancient woods that surround it shall remain forever untouched. It is a tithe of land, not of coin. It must never feel the bite of an axe nor the boot of industry. To break this sanctuary is to break the heart of the compact itself. A tithe of land, a perpetual wilderness preserve. That was the debt. They desecrated it, I breathed, the pieces falling into place. The logging. It wasn't just that they cut down some trees near the ridge. It was where they cut them. My fingers flew across the keyboard, searching the digital copies of the town's public records, a section of the library I had digitized years ago as a routine project. I searched for logging permits from the latter half of the 20th century. I found it in the records from 1978. A permit granted by the town council to a large timber company, allowing them to log a significant section of the western face of Old Man's Ridge. A map was attached, outlining the area. My blood ran cold as I looked at it. The logging zone, marked in red, ran right up to the edge of the summit, to the very border of the sacred grove. They hadn't cut down the standing stones, but they had surrounded them with a wasteland of stumps. They had violated the Guardian's innermost sanctum. That was the transgression. That was the scar. And the debt was one of desecration. We have to fix it, Chloe said, her voice steely. We can't uncut the trees, but we can honor the original agreement. We have to have that land, all of it, officially declared a permanent, protected nature preserve. We have to use our laws to reinforce the magical one. That would require a town council vote, I said, the scale of the challenge dawning on me. It would require a public hearing. Chloe, it would require us to tell everyone the entire, insane story. We were out of options. Hiding in the attic was no longer enough. To save Martha and the others, we had to take our secret public. And the first person we had to convince was the one man who had dedicated his life to keeping that secret buried. We found Sheriff Thompson at his desk, a mountain of paperwork before him. He looked up as we entered, and the weary resignation on his face told us he knew this wasn't a social call. This time, we didn't just show him a word on a notepad. We laid it all out. We showed him the Valley account ledger on the laptop screen. We showed him Blackwood's words about the sacred grove. And then we showed him the 1978 logging permit, signed and sealed by a former mayor. The proof was undeniable. Martha Gable doesn't know who her own granddaughter is, I told him, my voice quiet but firm. She's reliving the trauma of this broken promise. The peace you've been trying to keep, Sheriff? It's killing her. The only way to heal the scar is to pay the debt. We have to make the founder's promise of a sanctuary official, legally binding, forever. The sheriff stared at the screen, his face a grim, stony mask. He was a man caught between his inherited duty and the undeniable evidence of its failure. The silence in the office was deafening. He was at a crossroads, and his choice would determine the fate of the town. Finally, he took a long, slow breath and leaned back in his chair, scrubbing his hand over his tired face. He looked at us, and for the first time, I saw not an adversary, but a deeply burdened man who was out of options. "All right," he said, his voice heavy as a tombstone. "We'll call an emergency town meeting. I'll get the mayor to schedule it." He stood up and looked us both in the eye, his expression deadly serious. "But you'd better be damned sure you can convince them," he warned. "Because if this goes wrong, the panic will be 1,000 times worse than any forgetting. You wanted to wake this town up. Let's just pray you don't scare it to death." The 3 days leading up to the emergency town meeting were the most tense our community had experienced in living memory. The official notice, posted by the mayor at the sheriff's insistence, was vague and ominous, a meeting to discuss a matter of urgent historical importance to the future of our valley. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was the town bankrupt? Was the old mill site contaminated? The psychic scar that afflicted the population seemed to amplify the anxiety, making people irritable, suspicious, and prone to gossip. The fragile peace of our newly named haven was fraying at the seams. For Chloe and me, the attic was no longer a hideout but the nerve center for the most important presentation of our lives. We were no longer rebels operating in the shadows. With the sheriff's reluctant blessing, we had moved our entire operation, the laptop, the hard drive, the key documents, to the library's main study room. We worked under the full open light of day, a silent signal to the sheriff that we were preparing for a public revelation, not a secret coup. We spent every waking hour crafting our narrative. We were lawyers preparing a case, not for a jury of 12, but for a jury of an entire town. I organized the historical evidence, Silas Blackwood's eloquent writings about the compact, the clear financial records of the Valley Tithe, the damning 1978 logging permit with its incriminating map. My role was to be the voice of the past, to present the facts without embellishment. Chloe's role was to be the voice of the present. She designed a simple but powerful slideshow, translating the dense historical documents into clear, understandable visuals. She prepared to speak about the feeling of wrongness, the collective amnesia, and the very real present-day suffering of her grandmother. She was the human heart of our argument. The night before the meeting, Sheriff Thompson stopped by the library. He didn't come to check on our progress, but to offer a piece of grim, practical advice. "I've been thinking about tomorrow," he said, his voice low. He looked haggard, the weight of his family's long secret pressing down on him. "When you get up on that stage, don't talk about guardians and magic. People won't hear it. They'll panic. Talk about history. Talk about promises. Talk about a founder's vision for protecting the valley. Frame it as a historical debt we need to repay for the health of our community. Give them a story they can hold on to, not a monster to run from." It was the wisest counsel we could have received. He was telling us how to speak to the heart of our town, a language he understood better than anyone. The next evening, the high school auditorium was packed. It seemed every single resident of Havenwood was there, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anxiety, and outright fear. I saw Mr. Henderson with his arms crossed, a skeptical frown on his face. I saw the mayor and the town council on stage, looking deeply uncomfortable, and in the front row, Chloe had saved a seat for her grandmother. Martha Gable looked frail, but her eyes were lucid tonight, a small mercy that gave Chloe the strength she needed. When the mayor called us to the podium, a nervous hush fell over the auditorium. This was it. I stepped up to the microphone, my hands trembling, and began to tell our town its own forgotten story. I started with the familiar, with Silas Blackwood's dream of a haven. I walked them through the symbols of the festival, connecting the joy they had all recently felt with the history they had forgotten. Then, Chloe took over. She spoke with a raw, honest passion, her voice cracking only once, when she mentioned her grandmother. She put the image of the 1978 logging permit on the large screen behind us, the red lines of the logging zone a stark, angry wound on the map of the valley. She didn't accuse, she simply presented the facts. She spoke of the promise that had been broken, not by malice, but by time and forgetfulness. Then, for the final terrifying part, I stepped forward again. "The broken promise," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast room, "did more than just harm our valley. It wounded our very identity. It began to erase the second half of our name, the half that tied us to the woods." I revealed the full name, Havenwood, and the full story of the compact. I framed the guardian as Blackwood had, an ancient partner, a power in the valley to whom a solemn promise had been made. I explained the scar, the headaches, the confusion that people like Martha were suffering from, as a direct symptom of this broken spiritual contract. The reaction was instantaneous, a wave of chaos washing over the crowd. "This is insane," a man shouted from the back. "He's talking about curses." "My father was on the council in '78, another yelled. "He would never have knowingly done something like this." Fear, anger, and disbelief churned in the air. People were yelling, arguing, turning to their neighbors in panicked confusion. The mayor was banging his gavel, but it was useless against the tide of emotion. Just as the meeting was about to completely devolve, Sheriff Thompson walked to the podium. He stood there for a long moment, his presence alone silencing the room. He was the embodiment of grounded, undeniable authority, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of generations. "I don't know about curses or magic," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of the townspeople he had sworn to protect. "But I know this. My father, and his father before him, carried a heavy secret. They believed a promise was made when this town was founded. A promise to this valley. And they knew that promise had been broken. He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. They kept it quiet because they were afraid. Afraid of a panic just like this. They thought the silence would keep us safe. Looking around this room tonight, seeing what's happening to our friends, our parents, I can tell you they were wrong. The silence hasn't kept us safe. It has allowed a sickness to fester in the dark. He looked directly at Ethan and Chloe. It's time to bring it into the light. His words, a public breaking of his family's century-long vigil, stunned the crowd into a new, thoughtful silence. He had given our story credibility. He had given them permission to believe. I stepped back to the microphone one last time. There is a way to heal the scar, I said, my voice ringing with a newfound confidence. We must repay the debt. I propose that the town of Havenwood vote tonight to designate the 100 acres of land surrounding the standing stones on the summit as the Blackwood Sanctuary, a protected, forever wild preserve, to be legally and permanently returned to the valley. We must make the founders' promise our own, and make it binding. The mayor, looking shaken but seeing the tide of opinion turning, stood. A motion has been put forth, he said, his voice unsteady. All those in favor. The entire auditorium held its breath. The future of Havenwood, the healing of its scar, the payment of its ancient debt, all came down to this single moment. A choice, to be made not by heroes or librarians, but by the entire community, deciding together whether to retreat into the comfortable silence of the past, or to step forward into the light of their strange and difficult truth. The air in the high school auditorium was thick with a century of unspoken secrets and a future that was about to be decided. Every eye was on the mayor as he stood, gavel in hand, at the podium. The proposal to create the Blackwood Sanctuary, to legally and forever pay the town's ancient debt, hung in the charged atmosphere. This was no longer my story or Chloe's. It belonged to everyone now. The motion is on the floor, the mayor said, his voice resonating with a gravity the office had not required of him until this moment. All in favor of designating the lands as proposed, the Blackwood Sanctuary, please signify by raising your hand. For a heart-stopping second, no one moved. The weight of the decision, the sheer strangeness of it all, seemed to paralyze the entire room. Fear and uncertainty were powerful anchors. Then, a single, clear voice cut through the silence. It was Martha Gable. She was standing, leaning on Chloe for support, but her voice was the strongest it had been in weeks. Her hand was raised high, not trembling, but resolute. As the town's beloved elder, a living victim of the scar they had all felt, her vote was a powerful testament. Her courage broke the spell. Another hand went up, Mr. Henderson, the pragmatist, choosing history over doubt. Then another, and another. The parents of the school children, the members of the garden club, the teenagers in the back rows. It was not a unanimous flood, but a rising tide of determined hands. A solid, undeniable majority. The mayor's gaze swept across the room. He took a deep breath. The motion passes, he declared, and the final decisive strike of his gavel echoed through the auditorium like a crack of thunder. The moment the sound faded, a change swept through the room. It was not a sound or a sight, but a feeling. It was a gentle, pervasive wave of warmth and clarity, like a cool cloth being laid on a fevered brow. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the crowd. I saw people clutching their heads, not in pain, but in wonder, as the dull ache of the psychic scar that had plagued them finally dissolved into nothing. My eyes found Martha Gable. She stood straighter, the fog of confusion in her eyes clearing like a morning mist burning away in the sun. She turned to her granddaughter, and her face broke into a radiant, tearful smile of pure recognition. "Chloe, my dear," she said, her voice full of love. "Look what you've done. You've brought our name home. The debt was paid. The scar was healed. In a single, collective act of will, the town of Havenwood had reclaimed its soul. The days that followed were like the first days of spring after a long, hard winter. The anxiety that had gripped the community was gone, replaced by a vibrant, purposeful energy. The name Havenwood was everywhere, spoken with a newfound sense of ownership and pride. The story we had told at the meeting became the town's story, a shared, secret mythology that bound everyone together. A week later, the three of us, myself, Chloe, and Sheriff Thompson, felt the pull to go back to the ridge one last time. It was not a mission of fear, but a pilgrimage of thanks. The sheriff was a different man. The heavy, guarded burden he had carried his entire life had been lifted, replaced by a quiet, steady peace. The journey up the mountain was effortless. The woods felt alive and welcoming, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled, gentle patterns. The oppressive presence of the guardian was completely gone. The valley had exhaled. When we reached the summit, the circle of stone seemed to glow with a soft, internal light. In its center, our small sapling stood strong, its leaves greener and fuller than they should have been after only a week, already a testament to the renewed life in this place. We were not alone. It emerged not from shadow, but from the light itself. It was no longer a terrifying, faceless void. Its form was now woven from the very essence of the valley, the shimmering green of new leaves, the solid gray of ancient stone, the dancing light on moving water. It was still immense and powerful, but its nature was no longer angry or malevolent. It was the valley's true self, the genius loci, at peace. Its voice entered our minds, not with the cold ice of a threat, but with the warm, deep resonance of the earth itself. The debt is paid. The compact is renewed. The balance is restored. It held our gaze for a long moment, a look of ancient, neutral acknowledgement. It was not our friend, nor our enemy. It was our partner, as it had always been meant to be. Then, it turned and dissolved back into the landscape, its essence fading into the trees and the stones, leaving behind not a sense of absence, but of peaceful, watchful presence. Months turned into a year. Havenwood was a town reborn. The Blackwood Sanctuary was officially dedicated, with beautiful, hand-carved signs marking the trails. It became a cherished place, a destination for school trips and quiet family walks. It was a living reminder of the town's promise. Our lives found a new, fulfilling rhythm. I was no longer just a librarian, but the town historian, an official title voted on by the council. The library became the true heart of the community, a place where our story was kept safe. Chloe, with her sharp mind and fierce heart, had won a seat on that same council. She was now a guardian of Havenwood's future, ensuring the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. The sheriff maintained the law, but now he did so with a smile that always reached his eyes. One crisp autumn afternoon, I stood at the trailhead of the sanctuary, watching the leaves turn a brilliant gold, just as they had on that first, fateful day. A young family walked past me on their way up the trail. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 7, pointed to the sign. "Daddy," she asked, her small voice full of curiosity, "why is this place a sanctuary?" Her father knelt down and, with a gentle smile, began to tell her a story. "Because a long, long time ago," he began, "our town made a promise to the valley." I listened as he told her the tale of the compact, of the forgetting, and of the name that was a promise. The story was no longer a secret guarded in an attic. It was a gift, passed from one generation to the next. It was safe. The forgetting was truly and finally over. Our town had not only remembered its name, it had finally learned what it meant. Several years have passed since the town meeting that gave us back our name. The seasons have turned, the sapling on the ridge has grown strong, and the story of our forgetting has woven itself into the fabric of our new identity. I sit in my usual chair behind the main desk of the Havenwood Library, a place that feels more like the heart of our town than ever before. From my window, I can see the founder's oak in the center of the square, its great, ancient branches reaching towards a clear blue sky. The quiet, desperate panic of those strange weeks now feels like a half-remembered dream. The active, malevolent magic is gone from this valley. The Guardian, as we have come to understand it, has returned to its silent, watchful partnership. Its presence is no longer a threat felt in the shadows, but a peaceful certainty felt in the rustle of the leaves in the Blackwood Sanctuary, in the clean silver tone of the river, and in the enduring strength of the ridge that sleeps in stone. We learned that the magic that nearly erased us was not a curse laid upon us by a monster. It was the magic of a promise. An agreement between people and a place, so powerful that when it was neglected, the world itself began to unravel. The forgetting was just a symptom of a deeper wound, a broken relationship between a community and the land it called home. In healing the land, we healed ourselves. Our town is different now. We are quieter, perhaps, and more thoughtful. We have a shared, secret gravity. We are a community that has looked into the void of non-existence and chosen to remember. The town council, with Chloe as its most passionate voice, now weighs every decision about development and progress against the simple question: does this honor the compact? We are no longer just residents here, we are custodians. Sheriff Thompson retired last year, handing his badge to a capable young deputy. He spends his days now not patrolling, but walking. I often see him on the trails in the sanctuary, a man finally at peace, the heavy burden of his family's silence lifted forever. As for me, my life is much the same, yet infinitely richer. I am the keeper of the story, a role I cherish more than any other. I wrote it all down, of course. The full account, from the first smudged charter to the final town vote, is now the most requested book in the library's collection, The Story of Havenwood. A young girl approaches the desk, her arms laden with books. She is the daughter of the man I saw on the trailhead a few years ago. She places the stack on my desk, and on top is a well-worn copy of the book. "Checking these out again, Sarah?" I ask with a smile. She nods, her eyes bright with the endless curiosity of youth. She looks at me with the serious expression only a child can muster. "Mr. Hayes," she asks, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, "was the Guardian real? Is it still out there?" I pause, looking past her, out the window to the dark green line of the distant forest. I think of the shadowy figure, the psychic assault, and the final, beautiful resolution in the light. How to explain such a thing? "The Guardian is as real as the roots of that old oak tree," I tell her softly. "It's the feeling you get when you stand in the quietest part of the woods and listen. It's the spirit of the valley. And it's the promise we make to take care of this special place." I lean forward slightly. "It's not something to be afraid of anymore," I continue. "It's something to respect. As long as we remember our story, and we keep our promise to the wood, the Guardian will always be our partner." She seems satisfied with this answer, a truth that a child can understand better than most adults. I take her book and stamp the card inside with a satisfying, final thud. I hand it back to her, and she gives me a bright smile before running off towards the door, our town's history tucked safely under her arm. I watch her go, a small figure carrying a great story out into the afternoon sun. The story is no longer mine to guard, trapped in an attic or a dusty archive. It belongs to her now, and to all the children of Havenwood. It is alive, and it is safe. Our name is known. Our promise is kept. The balance, for now and for all the mornings to come, is restored.